July 2025. A 42-year-old Canadian poet and artist stands before investors announcing a $210 million Series B at a $3.5 billion valuation. His company, OpenEvidence, has achieved something unprecedented. It's being used by more than 40% of all physicians in the United States. But here's the interesting part. The product is completely free for doctors. No subscription fees, no usage limits, just free. A year earlier, OpenEvidence had approximately 360,000 physician consultations in an entire month. A year later, they hit that same number in a single day. This is the story of how a Harvard PhD who sold his previous company for $700 million and published poetry with Farrar, Straus, and Giroux went on to create the ChatGPT for doctors. To put this in perspective, this isn't a tech founder dabbling in poetry. Nadler is respected in the highest echelons of literature and contemporary art. Farrar, Straus, and Giroux doesn't publish tech entrepreneurs. They publish serious writers. The Museum of Modern Art doesn't put tech CEOs on their board. They choose influential voices in contemporary art and culture. This dual identity, poet and AI builder, artist and entrepreneur, is central to understanding what makes OpenEvidence different.
All right, welcome back, listeners. Today we're going to talk about OpenEvidence. OpenEvidence, it's a tool in the clinical decision support space. And now they have other features, but what does clinical decision support mean? As physicians, we are drowning in information, and OpenEvidence is similar to ChatGPT, where it helps physicians in finding answers related to treating their patients on a day-to-day basis. But these answers come from the guidelines that are used to treat our patients. If you're not a physician, you can't access OpenEvidence because as a physician or as a healthcare worker, you have to have a National Provider Identifier number. It's an NPI number to go and sign up and create an account. However, OpenEvidence, it's a great company and they have very interesting story. And today we're going to cover OpenEvidence story. And I'm very excited to start this. My name is Rupen Odabashian. I'm a hematology oncology physician, researcher, and I'm passionate advocate for technology in healthcare. Over the past 5 years, I worked with various companies and startups in advancing healthcare technology. As a practicing oncologist, I also bring my firsthand clinical experience to the podcast. I understand how healthcare works from a physician end and also from the patient end. Through this podcast, I want to talk about companies who are changing healthcare or making a delta in healthcare in our podcast, Delta Health Tech. And to do this, I'm honored to have also my co-host, Sam.
My name is Sam Hyder, and I come from a background of digital health, healthcare technology, and cybersecurity. And in the past, I've worked as a privacy officer for health programs at universities. And I have quite a bit of expertise in how technology can transform people's lives, from daily workflows to overall health outcomes. On this podcast, I'll try and bring a perspective that bridges the gap between healthcare operations and technology implementation, and while offering insights into the business strategies, regulatory considerations, and market dynamics that shape successful health tech companies. Together, we'll dive deep into the stories behind healthcare's most innovative companies, breaking down what made them successful and extracting lessons for founders, investors, and healthcare professionals alike.
Remember, listeners, this is not a financial advice. Sam and I might or might not have investment in the companies that we discuss. However, for this podcast episode, we don't have any financial interest to disclose. Please do your own due diligence before investing in any of the companies that we mention on this podcast.
Before we dive in, we just want to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's episode. This episode is brought to you by PMWC 2026, the Precision Medicine World Conference. It's being hosted this year from March 4th through 6th at the Santa Clara Convention Center, and it's co-hosted by a phenomenal group of organizations, Stanford, UCSF, and Yale. And this is actually their 25th anniversary. And the theme for this year's conference is From Code to Cure. Over 2,500 decision makers, 400 plus speakers, 12 tracks, And major players in the healthcare and health technology industry like Carl Brockman from OpenAI, Carl June from UPenn, Vinod Khosla, James Zhu from Stanford, and Judy Faulkner from Epic. If you're at the intersection of AI and medicine, this is the conference you want to be at. Head over to PMWCintl.com and use code DeltaHealth, DeltaHealth, for a discount on registration. You can also click on the link in the show notes.
Click now. We're going to talk about OpenEvidence, but to understand OpenEvidence, we have to talk about Daniel Nadler. And we're going back in time to go back to Toronto, Canada, 1983. This is where our story begins. Not in Silicon Valley, not in a college dorm room, but in a Canadian household where science and imagination weren't opposing forces. They were family dinner conversations. Daniel's parents were immigrants. His father came from Poland. His mother came from Romania. They were part of the wave of the Eastern European families who arrived in North America with advanced degrees. And they had unshakable belief that education was the currency that mattered the most. But here is what makes Daniel's father particularly fascinating. He wasn't just an engineer. He specialized in using sound to detect microscopic cracks in structures like bridges and submarines. 25 years later, Daniel himself would find the cracks in industries like finance and healthcare and try to gap the knowledge cracks before they become errors.
Going back to Toronto now, we don't have extensive details about Daniel's childhood in Toronto. He's not really one for nostalgic interviews about his formative years, but we can piece together some things about his environment. Now, this was Toronto in the 1980s and 1990s, Canada's most multicultural city, a place where being the child of immigrants wasn't unusual. It was actually very common. But the Nadler household wasn't typical by any standard. Picture this: a father who teaches machines to listen, who works at the intersection of physics, engineering, and practical problem solving. Not theoretical physics, applied physics. Not academic for the sake of being academic, but academic for the sake of building something useful so that bridges don't collapse, submarines don't sink, and real problems are solved. And then comes Daniel, the son, who somehow absorbs both the analytical rigor and develops an entirely separate obsession: poetry. Now, we'll get to that Harvard education in a moment, but let's sit with this paradox, because understanding Daniel Nadler, the founder, requires understanding Daniel Nadler, the artist. These aren't two different people. They're the same person, and that's what makes him dangerous as a competitor and powerful as a builder.
Now, let's talk about the early 2000s. Around that time, Daniel arrives at Harvard. Let's say around 2001, 2002, working backward from his 2016 PhD graduation. He's in his late teens, a Toronto kid, at America's most prestigious university. He does something unusual. He doesn't just study mathematics. He doesn't just study classics. He studies both mathematics and classics, the analytical and humanistic, the rigorous and the interpretive, the objective and the subjective. Most Harvard students pick a lane: pre-med, economics, computer science, government. You optimize for recruiting, finding a job, for graduate school admissions, for a clear career path, man. But Daniel said no. He's going to study number theory and ancient Greek literature simultaneously. And he's going to be world class at both. While he's studying mathematics and classics, he's also writing poetry, not as a hobby. No. This guy excels at the things that he do. He has serious artistic practice. And his mentor isn't just any creative writing professor. It's Jory Graham, who won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. One of the most acclaimed poets in America is personally mentoring this mathematics major. What does this tell us? It tells us that Daniel Nadler, even at around his 20s, was already building a personal brand of intellectual ambition that didn't fit any existing template.
Now, I just want to talk about really quickly how hearing this story about Daniel Nadler's background and his passion for art, it reminds me a little bit about Steve Jobs' early years as well. He was somebody who, at the university that he went there to really study and understand art. And it's where he developed his passion for fonts and for how to display information in a creative and interesting way. We can draw a lot of parallels between these two individuals in terms of how they approach the intersection of art and technology.
I want to add something here. It's interesting if you just study accomplished people. There is something about art, also there is something about math. Last time we talked about Jeff Tagney, the CEO of Doximity. He also had a huge interest in math early in his career and in high school. And same applies here, Daniel. And I think the same applies if we look at other great accomplished people, like, for example, Elon Musk, Anthropic CEO. I think understanding math gives you different way of thinking, systematic way of thinking. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts is that from a foundational perspective, mathematics, physics, these are both kind of key foundational knowledge that you need to build in the spaces that Elon Musk, the CEO of Anthropic, built in. And I think if you can understand and really gain a very solid understanding of the mathematics and the physics, whether it's mathematics behind machine learning or the physics behind rocket launches, right? If you know those things down perfectly, then the rest becomes very easy to figure out as you go along and as you try and develop the company, because you know the foundational mathematics or the foundational physics behind what you're building.
I agree. I think having that thinking process and thinking based on the first principles and breaking down its main components, math helps with that.
I would agree. Now, after undergrad, Daniel continued at Harvard for his PhD. The focus of his PhD was pricing mechanisms of credit derivatives. Now, this is a technical and highly quantitative area of work, deep mathematics applied to financial instruments. And it's the kind of research that normally gets you recruited to Goldman Sachs or the Federal Reserve. And in fact, that's exactly what happens. During his PhD studies, Daniel ended up becoming a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve doesn't just let random grad students wander the halls. You get invited because someone thinks your work matters, because you're operating at the frontier of quantitative finance, and because you understand both the mathematics and the real-world implications. Now we're starting to paint a bit of a portrait. Daniel is simultaneously writing poetry, studying the pricing of complex financial instruments, and working with the central bank of the United States. He's in his mid-20s, he's seeing how Wall Street actually works as an insider, and he's getting an understanding of how do we mathematically model systemic risk. And here's what he learns. Wall Street analysts are drowning in information. Think about what that means. You're a research every day, dozens of news articles, earning reports, SEC filings, commodity prices, geopolitical developments. How does one individual synthesize all of that? How do you make strong evidence-based decisions? Back in 2010, 2011, 2012, the answer was, you don't, not really. You have your Bloomberg terminal, you have an army of analysts, you have research reports from other banks, and you have your Excel models, but fundamentally, you're doing human-powered information synthesis, and it's not scalable, nor is it fast enough, and you end up missing things. Daniel Nadler, visiting scholar, PhD candidate, sees this gap. And somewhere in his mind, a seed is planted. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning, news breaks that North Korea has conducted a ballistic missile test. Or maybe there's a terrorist attack in Europe. Or the European Central Bank makes an unexpected policy announcement. The kind of events that move markets, that affect millions of people, and that could trigger economic ripples across an entire global financial system. What happens next at the Federal Reserve is that analysts start practically digging through old news clips. They're manually creating spreadsheets for their reports. They're trying to remember, wait, what happened the last time North Korea did something similar? What about the time before that? What happened to airline stocks, defense stocks? How do currency markets shift? And Daniel's watching all of this and thinking, this is an insane way of going about things, because he realizes they have all the data. They have decades of financial market history. They have the archives, the economic indicators, the announcements from the central banks, and the corporate earnings. When you have everything you could possibly need to answer the question of what typically happens to X when Y occurs, the main thing that rises to the surface is that nobody has a way to actually ask that question and get an answer without an army of analysts preparing reporting.
But listeners, you have to remember, this is in 2013. ChatGPT was not there. Anthropic Cloud was not there. Finding information was very hard. Today, the average Joe can go, and if an event happened, we can use all these AI tools to analyze history and sometimes predict what's going to happen now or in the future. But in 2013, all you had is a Google search, and then you have to go and read article by article and find your answer in specific articles, and you have to spend hours in this. This was really game-changing.
And when you want to look at how a defense stock performs after previous North Korean missile tests, for example, there's a multi-step process that an analyst used to have to go through, where they have to identify the data, they have to look up what companies are classified as defense stocks in the first place. They have to do statistical analysis and create charts and write up your findings. This is essentially an entire work week, right? 40 hours of a skilled analyst's time.
Now, let's talk about the founding moment. Daniel starts working on this idea immediately. This is not an academic project. No. He works on this as a company. He doesn't finish his PhD first. He doesn't write more papers. He doesn't wait. He gets a few friends together and he starts building. And that's where things start getting interesting. Within weeks, they've put together a small team and they received early funding. But guess from whom? Google Ventures capital arm looks at this Harvard PhD candidate who wants to build an AI system that can answer natural language questions about financial markets. And they write him a check before he builds a product, before he has customers, before AI is even a mainstream term that normal people understand. And that's how Kensho Technologies was officially founded in May 2013. The elevator pitch for Kensho was simple. This is Google for financial markets. They wanted to organize the information of financial markets, but not Google as in show me a web page that might have the answer. Google as in like you ask a question in plain English and you get an answer generated fresh based on analyzing massive amount of structured and unstructured data. So what they trying to build in concept, it's very similar to the theory of what Google wanted to do, to organize the information of the world. And using Kensho, it's not like you ask a question and you wait for hours until you get your answer. You get your answers in seconds, not 40 hours. Based on my research, I think on average, an analyst needs like 40 hours to find an answer and do their analysis. Again, I'm not a financial expert, but this is like an average number that I read online. That these were in the old days. But with Kensho, you can get your answer in seconds. And Kensho wasn't just a startup. No. Much beyond that. And spoiler alert, this will become important as we talk about OpenEvidence. But Harvard undergrads in the coding and tech scene, they had two options, either to go to Wall Street or to go to Kensho. So it was so prestigious that some students didn't even finish their degrees because they wanted to work there full time.
Now, after launching Kensho in 2013, the next 5 years, they're in a period of hypergrowth. They go out and raise significant venture capital. Unfortunately, we don't have the complete funding numbers, but we know at minimum they raised about $68 million before being acquired. And They're hiring engineers like crazy from Google, Apple, MIT, Harvard, the top tier, cream of the crop technical talent. And they're signing clients, they're getting customers, and not just small clients, right? We're talking about organizations like Goldman Sachs, major global banks, investment firms, some of the biggest names on Wall Street. We now have a company that's using AI to solve information overload problems, serving both financial services and national security. And they're making highly trained experts more effective by giving them better tools. And they've done this by building natural language interfaces so that non-technical people can access this sophisticated analysis. I hope you're starting to see a bit of a pattern here. And the recognition for Kensho comes in 2017 at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Kensho is named one of the most innovative and impactful technology companies in the world. Daniel becomes the director of research for financial technology at Stanford University School of Engineering, and this is in his early 30s.
In February 2017, that's when things become more interesting. S&P Global, the massive financial data and analytics company, the same as the S&P 500 index, yes, leads a $50 million funding round in Kensho. They go and invest in the company. This is not just an investment. S&P Global isn't your typical venture capital firm. They are strategic investors. They are potential acquirers, and they already a Kensho client at that time. They were already a Kensho client at that time. They invest $50 million. They start working closely with Kensho's team. They start integrating Kensho's technology into their product. They are essentially doing a tested drive. And apparently, they really like what they see.
In the spring of 2018, an announcement drops. S&P Global is acquiring Kensho Technologies for approximately $550 million in cash and stock. Now, some sources have reported this number to be as high as $700 million, depending on earnouts and how you calculate the stock component, but we're going to go with the announced public figure of $550 million. Now, keep in mind, spring of 2018, that means this is a 5-year-old company, and at the time they had approximately $20 million in annual revenue based on our research. Now, you might be thinking $20 million in annual revenue, and they're being sold for a little over $500 million. Doug Peterson, the CEO of S&P Global, says this during an analyst call. Unless you cover the technology industry, this is not a routine acquisition. We're buying a startup company with proven talent and technology. We're not buying a business with meaningful revenue or profitability.
If you look at the numbers, I might be wrong, but I assume they were maybe breaking even or maybe losing money, but the acquisition really focused on the technology they built. S&P bought technology. They didn't buy a business. They bought something that they can generate money from by incorporating into their infrastructure. The other thing is, and that's something for my investment thesis, we think in the VC world and in angel investment world, we think about how big the TAM is and how strong the founders are. But I think we should think of how important this technology is for the existence of other companies, because other companies might buy the technology regardless of the TAM, regardless of how big the market is. The TAM is the total addressable market for our listeners.
From an investment thesis perspective, I agree, but just going back to the revenue multiple here, right? If we're assuming that it's a 20 million annualized recurring revenue, and they're selling for 550 million, which is the public figure, that's essentially slightly over a 20x revenue multiple.
Yeah, around 25.
And that's a revenue multiple that is valuing the company at $500 million, but their revenues are nowhere near that. And while that might sound absurd to you for those that are coming from a finance background, but I'll remind you of one interesting thing, right? Google bought YouTube in November of 2006 for about $1.65 billion in Google stock. Today, YouTube's estimated to be worth to Google around close to $500 billion. So that just goes to show that sometimes companies make acquisitions that may seem super overvalued to us, but really they're investing and they're buying that technology because they're thinking that this is going to unlock an exponential revenue opportunity for us by getting in early and buying this technology, even though the revenues aren't there to support it.
That's a very interesting example. YouTube could have not become what YouTube is today if they were not acquired, because scaling YouTube at that time required massive infrastructure that YouTube itself, they didn't have. And also they were drowning in lawsuits and they were being hit right and left. When Google acquired the technology and the company, now they can figure out a way to scale this and take it to the next level. I would say also like the founders did not lose by selling the company at that time, because if you left YouTube by the hands of the founders, unfortunately, I don't think YouTube would have become what YouTube is today.
And now going back to Kensho Technologies, Forbes called it the most valuable AI acquisition of the 2010s. Now, I think it's important to pause here and just put that in a bit of context, right? The 2010s saw Google acquiring DeepMind for about $500 million. Apple acquired Siri and other AI companies as well. And, the rest of the FANG companies, as well as Microsoft as well, they're all making AI acquisitions. But Kensho is a finance-focused AI startup that's founded by a poetry-winning PhD candidate. They're the biggest pure-play AI acquisition of the decade. And at this point in time, Daniel Nadler is about 35 years old. He's achieved complete financial independence, depending on how much of the company he owned. He likely made tens of millions of dollars personally, potentially over $100 million.
Which becomes very important.
Yes, that number will come back later. So Daniel's really at a point now where he could retire. Instead, what does he decide to do? He stays on at Kensho. He keeps building, he keeps leading the team because, and this is important, he's not done solving the problem.
And Kensho today operates as the AI and innovation hub for S&P Global. And they have like a suite of AI products, including Kensho Scribe, which transcribes earnings calls and financial audio, Kensho Nerd, Kensho Extract. So it's a suite of AI products for S&P Global. And I want to cover here, there are, I think, multiple lessons we can extract from Kensho and how they apply to OpenEvidence. I think one of the important lessons is domain-specific AI trained on high-quality data beats general AI every time. This is an important lesson. My assumption is Kensho's models are domain-specific trained models. And having a specialized AI, it's much better than general AI. And then the other important lesson is, and this also going to apply to OpenEvidence, natural language interface improve and enhance experts, augment experts. Similar to financial analysts, natural language interfaces in today's world with the clinical decision support tools augments physicians' ability to take care of their patients.
And it's important to remember as well that before Kensho, you needed to be a quantitative analyst that had advanced Excel modeling skills, financial tool modeling skills, to be able to answer these complex market questions. After Kensho, anybody could just ask the question in plain English. And as Rupen touched on, this is really important for when Daniel builds OpenEvidence, where doctors don't need to be research experts or advanced analysts.
Now we're going to talk about the other part of Daniel, and I will try to be as brief as possible, but I can't just jump and not cover this part. Daniel, while he's getting his Harvard PhD, he's also working at the Federal Reserve. He understands financial markets, but he also does something else. While building Kensho, raising millions of dollars, in 2016, while he's very deep into his company, he publishes a book of poetry. And this is not self-published thing. No. He goes and published in FSG. This is like literally the publisher of poems in the United States. Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. That's what FSG stands for. And the book called Lacunae, which is mainly 100 small pieces of small poems. And in 2016, the National Public Radio names Lacunae one of the best books. This isn't just a tech CEO dabbling in creative writing as a hobby. No, he takes this seriously. He's very competitive, and he doesn't only wants to excel in building a company, he also excels in other parts in life, like the artistic part of Daniel. I don't think lots of people know this about him. In 2018, Daniel, at the age of 35, he's elected to the boards of the Academy of American Poets. And at that time, he was considered the youngest person ever elected to the boards in the Academy's 85 years history. In 2020, Daniel joins the Whitney Museum's Digital Art Committee, and in 2021, Daniel is elected to the board of directors of Museum of Modern Art. He has a huge interest in art, which I think also helps him in building open evidence.
And based off of all of these lessons that he's learned from Kensho, he brings each and every single one of these lessons, these learnings that Rupin and I just described, into another knowledge-intensive profession. Now, we know lawyers are drowning in case law and legal precedent. Engineers are drowning in technical specs and research papers. And for doctors are drowning in medical literature. And Rupin, maybe you can just tell me a little bit about just how much of a problem this is and why it's important for doctors to keep up their exposure to medical knowledge to be able to become better practitioners.
To tell you about this, I have to tell you about the information crisis of medicine. Let me paint a picture of where we are in 2025 and then give you a history lesson of how we are in this spot today. On one hand, let's say if you are a patient with cancer, the odds of survival are dramatically better than they were even 10 years ago. The 5-year survival rate of all cancers combined went from 49% in 1970s nearly to 70% today. And it's accelerating. It's amazing. We have so many new treatments that's popping up. For example, one of the treatment is called like CAR T therapy. What CAR T therapy means is if you have a cancer, we can take your immune cells, send them to a factory, and teach them how cancer cells look like, and then bring these cells, put them back in your body, and these immune cells are going to be able to fight the cancer. And this treatment was approved by the FDA in 2017, but now we have over 2,000 clinical trials running using CAR T therapy. This isn't just cancer. We are seeing breakthroughs in rare genetic diseases, in autoimmune conditions, in infectious diseases. Moderna and Pfizer, they developed like their COVID vaccine in days. We're talking about like days. This is actual messenger RNA sequencing that was designed over a weekend in January 2020. From a scientific standpoint, we are living in the absolute golden age. But on the other hand, if you look at the medical literature, in 2024, there was a landmark study published in JAMA. For our listeners who don't know what JAMA is, a Journal of American Medical Association. It is considered one of the top medical journals in the field. So we have a study that was published in JAMA, showed that 63% of physicians reported at least one symptom of burnout. Surprise, obviously. And that's nearly like 2/3 of doctors in the United States, and not only the United States, in Canada. I work in both countries, and I know how is it like. And we're not talking about just being tired or stressed out. No. We're talking about like a clinical syndrome characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization. Physicians are withdrawn. Physicians are lacking empathy sometimes when it comes to treating patients. When they see like 100 patients a day, at the end of the day, you cannot empathize with everyone. And about 400 physicians die by suicide every year in the United States. That's roughly one per day. The suicide rate among physicians is more than double that of the general population. I'm telling you all these facts to tell you one concept, that physicians in the United States are burned out. There are so many reasons. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert in the field, but I'm a physician. I live it day by day, and I see how my job evolved even over the last 3 years. I've seen how my job evolved over the last 3 years. One of the contributing reasons is the explosion of medical information. In 2007, a study found that the average time doctor spent looking things up during a patient encounter, which is a patient visit, is around 2 minutes. 2 minutes to make potentially life or death decisions sometimes. So they are relying on memory. They are relying on their training data back to medical school, which could be like 20, 30, 10 years old. I don't know, depending on where they are in their journey. And the reason is we have always to look up the most recent data is we practice medicine based on evidence. And this is what is called evidence-based practice. The ideal clinical decision should be made after looking up the most recent evidence on how to treat a specific condition. But there is a massive lag between what we know and what is being written every single day. So the amount of information there is increasing exponentially. And let me take you through a history how this became where we are today.
The starting point for this history requires us to go back to the pre-1990s era. Imagine it's 1985, you're a doctor at a major hospital, and you need to access medical knowledge. The first source that you have is, of course, your medical school education. You went to 4 years of med school, then 3 to 7 years of residency, depending on whatever you specialized in. That's a lot of training. During that time, you basically memorized a core body of knowledge. You had your textbooks, and there was a very prominent textbook at that time, right? Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, which is literally considered or called Harrison's Bible by medical students. Rupen, do they still use this today?
I don't think so. I think that's a great question. Maybe some people still buy it, but I think you can get it as a PDF version electronically. And I can't remember the last time I read a real paper-based textbook or Harrison. But I'm an oncologist too. Harrison is for internal medicine mainly.
Interesting, right? So Harrison's Bible, as it was called by medical students, had major editions that came out every 3 to 4 years. And that was actually fine for the time period because medical knowledge did not change that fast. And not to say that medical knowledge wasn't changing at all, but it was changing at a manageable pace. So if you learned something in med school in 1980, there was a good chance it would still be mostly correct in 1990. Now, for new research, though, you relied on journal subscriptions. Your hospital library would subscribe to the major journals, the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, the Lancet, BMJ, and they'd come in the mail, physical mail. You'd go to the library, sit down and read them, and if you needed to, you could photocopy an article you wanted to keep. Now, it's important to touch on how information and knowledge management actually worked in 1980 because there was no PubMed. PubMed didn't even launch until 1996. And so in the 1980s, if you wanted to search the medical literature, you had a few options and none of them were really simple. There was something called the Index Medicus, which was a thick, very heavy printed volume that was published monthly by the National Library of Medicine. It's been published since 1879, so it was around for quite a long time. And it's like a phone book, but for medical articles. And each month, a new volume would arrive at your hospital library. And at the end of the year, you'd get a massive volume that basically compiled everything. And these weren't small books, right? We're talking about volumes that are very heavy, several inches thick, and they sat on library shelves. And so if you wanted to get access to them, you'd have to go into the library. Then the computerized alternative came about, but it still wasn't something that a doctor could access from their office. Back in 1971, the National Library of Medicine launched Medline, which stood for Medlars Online, where Medlars was the Medical Literature Analysis and Retrieval System. This was a computerized database of medical literature citations. But the catch was, even in 1980, you couldn't search Medline yourself. You had to go to a specially trained medical librarian, and you'd explain to them what you were looking for, and the librarian would sit at a specialized computer terminal. Remember, we're talking about the 1980s here, where, green text on a black screen that's connected via a phone line to the National Library of Medicine's mainframe computer. And every single search would cost money, sometimes even several dollars per search. And you'd wait until the librarian constructed complex Boolean queries that used controlled vocabulary terms called MESH. MESH stands for medical subject headings.
I would add one thing here. We still use MESH today to search PubMed. So this term is still in use today.
That's crazy to me that I would call it antiquated workflow now for medical librarian using Boolean queries to be able to pull from MESH is still something that they carried over to when PubMed released in the 1990s.
Yeah, I don't know about that. Maybe. So I was taught in medical school and in residency how to use the MESH terms. We're going to talk about PubMed, but think about them as keywords that help you search PubMed. And for our listeners who don't know what PubMed is, PubMed, it's a huge library that contains all the research articles that are related to medicine and healthcare. I was taught how to search this database. I don't know if students are still being taught that, because to be honest with you, in this day and age, I don't search PubMed directly. I just type my query through different clinical decision support AI tools, and then they get me those references, and then click on these references, and they will take me to PubMed. I don't know, maybe I was the last generation who taught, I don't know, maybe they're still teaching this, but this is going to become I think, obsolete.
I think it's interesting because the role and the function of a medical librarian still exists today. At my time when I was working at the University of Toronto at the Dahlon School of Public Health, one of the programs we worked on quite literally had a medical librarian on staff that would be responsible for using basically these citation management systems for the core purpose of being able to pull specific medical literature. So I think it goes to reason that even today, the role of a medical librarian still exists, maybe not in the exact way of needing to use Boolean queries, but they still play a critical role in medical research.
I agree. Also, medical librarians, they have other roles other than just helping you search the literature and retrieve the information from PubMed. So they do add value. But yeah, I don't know what's going to happen to the MESH terms in this day and age.
So when it comes to the actual volume of literature, though, in 1980, about 300,000 articles were published across all of medicine for the entire year, which comes out to about 800 articles per day across all medical specialties worldwide. Now compare that to today. PubMed, at present, indexes about 2,000 to 4,000 new articles every single day. That's a 2 to 4x multiplier over what it used to be in the 1980s.
That's every single day. There are 2,000 to 4,000 new articles every single day.
Even more important than the volume of medical literature was just how quickly change was taking place. Medical practice was relatively stable, and the half-life of medical knowledge, which, for those that don't know, the half-life is the time it takes for half of what you learn to become outdated, was estimated at the time to be decades, not years, decades. And so if you learned something in 1980, there was still a decent chance that it would be mostly correct in 1990. And so even though the system was slow, it was manageable. And the bottleneck wasn't that there was an information overload, it was more so information access. You had to go through quite extensive process just to be able to extract this information. If you had a clinical question, getting an answer could take days or even weeks instead of minutes.
I just want to add my take here as well. So my field is oncology. Oncology is the fastest changing field. Like the amount of knowledge we have, it's crazy which is great. I'm very excited. I'm very, very excited about this because now we have many more treatment options for our patients. I recently finished my training, and over the last 3 years, so many things has changed. Right now, we do have better treatment options for many cancers, including, for example, pancreatic cancer, including, for example, bladder cancer, including, for example, breast cancer. Within 3 years, I had to learn, forget, relearn bring the new information in my brain of understanding in new treatments, their side effects, and what we use for a specific type of cancer. So this is a huge, I wouldn't say problem. It's something we have to work on because eventually it's helping people, it's helping patients.
And going back to the late 80s and early 90s now, we might remember that in I believe it was 1990, the Human Genome Project was launched, where they were going to map every single gene in the human body, which would enable all sorts of new treatments. At the same time as this, you had massive advances in imaging, CT scans, MRIs getting better and more accessible, as well as new classes of drugs coming out. And so the pace of discovery was accelerating. And then the new kid on the block arrived, and that was the internet.
Now, we have to take you to the early digital days, the search era. In 1996, the National Library of Medicine launched an experimental project called PubMed. By 1997, it was officially free to the public. This was a huge shift. Suddenly, the physical walls of medical library that Sam was just talking about came down. And instead of going into a basement in a library and flipping through the dusty card catalogs or heavy volumes of Index Medicus, you could sit at desk, type a few keywords or mesh words, and instantly pull up millions of articles. It was revolutionary at that time. Like within few years, PubMed was filling millions of searches every single day. Doctors finally had the world's medical knowledge at their fingertip. But there was a catch. Search is not synthesis. And I can tell you from my end, if I'm seeing a patient, I can't just go read an article and expect that this article is going to teach me or tell me how to treat my patients. No. Search, finding an article, reading an article, these are very different from synthesis. And the process of searching PubMed, it's not easy where you go to PubMed and you type a couple of keywords or mesh words, and then you get one article, and then you have to read this one article where you get your answer. No. PubMed is public. You can go and access PubMed. If you search something, you get 500 relevant results. And if you don't know how to do the search properly, you're going to get 5,000 relevant articles. And then each article is related to another article and so on. It's just like you're on your browser and then you start opening a tab. One tab leads to another, one tab leads to another. And then suddenly you forget what was the question you were asking. PubMed was good of indexing the literature, but not accessing specific information in the literature. Other companies saw this gap as an opportunity. In 1992, a physician named Burton Rose founded a company called UpToDate. And it wasn't a search engine. No. It was a clinical decision support tool. I think UpToDate is one of the earliest companies that was in this space. Now, instead of giving the reader a list of papers to read and synthesize the information from this paper to know how to treat and approach specific disease, UpToDate gave you the answer in form of an article. You have, let's say you're a physician, you subscribe to UpToDate, which is around like $500 to $700 a year. You get access to the platform. You look up a condition, for example, heart failure. And then the site will provide you with 10, 15 articles about heart failure. And each article is about 4 to 5 pages long, which is a synthesis of the best practices written and updated by experts in the field. It was like having the world's smartest specialists on a speed dial, writing things for you and helping you in treating your patients. Doctors love this. By the mid-2000s, UpToDate had over 1 million users and was generating hundreds of millions in revenue. But remember one thing, that you needed the expert physician to put together this data. And UpToDate became the gold standard for point-of-care medicine. Do you think the problem was solved? Not quite. UpToDate was still a human-driven system, as I told you. It relied on physicians to read, write, update every single entry, which meant it could never truly keep pace with the accelerating flood of new data. And from physician perspective, they consider UpToDate expensive. The $500 to $700 a year, it's not something that physicians want to pay. And this is something you can see on multiple Reddits. So usually hospitals will buy access to UpToDate, or you as a physician, you will just bite the bullet and get access to UpToDate.
In the early 2000s, medicine was a world of paper, right? Manila folders bulged with handwritten notes, and doctors' handwriting wasn't just a joke. It was a safety hazard. Charts got lost, and if you saw a specialist across town or in another city, your records might as well have been on another planet. Digitizing wasn't just a good idea. It felt like a moral imperative. And for many of our listeners, they might remember that when you would go to the doctor's office in the 90s, the 2000s, you'd go up to the reception desk, and behind the reception desk, there would be a huge, almost like a rotating bookshelf that was electronic, and you would go up and then the nurse would push a few buttons and the whole bookcase would rotate. And that's how they would extract and pull your medical record so that they could pass it off to the doctor because you had an appointment. The electronic health record sought to solve that problem, where charts no longer got lost, and it was seen that the EHR was going to be medicine's great library. And so imagine every heartbeat, every lab result, and every medication history available at a click and shared instantly between every doctor in the country. Now, in 2009, the Obama administration moved to make this vision a reality through something called the HITECH Act. They put $27 billion on the table to incentivize adoption. But this wasn't just a carrot. It came with a stick. If hospitals didn't adopt EHRs and prove they were hitting specific federal targets, a program known as Meaningful Use, they would face stiff financial penalties in their Medicare reimbursements. The result was an explosion. In 2008, only 9% of hospitals were digital. In 2015, that number hit 96%. You might think, hey, mission accomplished, but not even close. And here's why. EHRs, you may have encountered commonplace EHR names. There's Epic, there's Cerner, there's Meditech, there's Aetna Health. You might think all of these EHRs were built for the patient, but in actuality, they were built for the payment. In the US, doctors are paid through a labyrinth of codes. To get reimbursed, a doctor has to prove they did the work by checking specific boxes. The major EHR vendors built massive, clunky databases that were world-class at capturing billable data and meeting the idea of meaningful use, but they were nightmares for clinical workflows. Now, despite the promise of sharing this data that many vendors engaged in, what ended up happening was you had a situation where now vendors were instead choosing to go down a path of information blocking. They built digital silos that didn't talk to their competitors, making it nearly impossible for a patient's data to flow from one EHR to another EHR at another hospital system.
And I can talk and add a bit on this. It still happens until this day and age. As a physician, when a patient gets transferred to me from another facility, let's say they will come and they want to see me for a second opinion regarding their cancer. It's not like electronically they can email the data from one hospital to another. No, they might fax it because fax is secure and HIPAA compliant to my hospital. Or the patient might or have to print their records on paper, A4 papers, and bring them to my hospital. And also, if they have imaging, that includes like a CT scan, an ultrasound, an MRI, these get transferred over. Are you ready? Do you know what we still use this day? CDs. If you haven't seen CDs in a while, come to healthcare. Yes, patients' imaging gets transferred with CDs. The patient brings their imaging on a CD to my hospital, and then I have to give this CD to one of the administrative people. They put the CD on a computer that has a CD reader, compact disc, and then they upload it to our servers. It's just like a nightmare. It is a nightmare.
It's a nightmare, I agree, and I think it's an archaic method of being able to manage and handle data. And look, I'm the biggest proponent of HIPAA and the importance of protecting personal health information. I believe that it is some of the most vulnerable data that you can have about a person if you have access to their medical records. But I want to remind all of our listeners of something, and this is something that is ingrained in federal law. As much as EHR systems may try and engage in information blocking, like we mentioned, at the end of the day, your personal health information and your personal health records, by federal law, belong to you. You have every right to request them at any moment in time, and at no point can a hospital say, no, sorry, we're not going to give you your records. It's your data and it's your information, and you will always have the ability to get a copy of that data, and you can share that data with whoever you wish. And that right will always remain with you because you as the patient have and will always retain access to your own data. Now, the impact on the daily life of a doctor was devastating with the introduction of electronic health record systems. In the paper era, a note was a super concise story, something like, hey, patient is doing well, can see you in 3 months. In the EHR era, though, that same visit and that same note now required clicking through 15 screens and satisfying dozens of regulatory prompts. And a study done just 10 years ago confirmed that this is in fact a nightmare, where for every 1 hour spent face-to-face with the patient, doctors were drowning in 2 hours of EHR and administrative desk work. To understand just how deep this crisis went, though, let's look at the data in a bit more detail. As I mentioned, in 2016, researchers set out to map the new reality of the American doctor. And so they followed 57 physicians, specialists in family medicine, internal medicine, cardiology, and orthopedics across 4 different states in the US. And they logged 430 hours of direct observation in ambulatory care settings. So they definitely approached the study with a high level of rigor. And if you're interested in reading the study, the title of it is Allocation of Physician Time in Ambulatory Practice by Dr. Christine Sinsky. And the findings that came out of it were a tragedy.
It's not only the overworked physician. The problem was beyond that. It was the relationship between the physician and the patient. Even when a doctor was present physically in the room with the patient, their mind, their hands were elsewhere. And this is something I experienced from 2022 to till now with the rise of the AI Scribe. And I post on this on my LinkedIn. AI Scribes maybe didn't save me lots of time, but they saved me, and they still save me, mental effort. Before the AI Scribe era, the exam room was a physician spending 37% of their time bound to the computer, typing whatever the patient is saying, because they have to do this 15 to 20 times a day. They have to see 15 to 20 patients a day. They can't just rely on their memory to remember everything and every detail and every order they put for every single patient. When they are in the room, they have to open the electronic medical record, navigate 10,000 clicks to reach a single point of data or information, because there are 10,000 ways of doing or reaching to a specific data point in the EHR. Then they have to type whatever this patient is seeing or saying in their notes. And then beyond that, they have to document things that might not be necessary, but they have to document it for the sake of billing. For example, one of the things that physicians document in their note is review of systems, which means the physician asks extensively questions related to different organs, not related to exactly what the patient is presenting with. For example, if a patient presents with shortness of breath, their insurance requires you to ask questions related to bowel habits, related to sleep, related to weight, related to this, related to that, to make your note comprehensive, and so you can get billed. And it was one of the requirements of being paid. However, is this important to solve a patient's problem? As a physician, I can tell you 100% no. Usually you have a mental tree, a mental model to navigate patient symptoms. If a patient comes with shortness of breath and their history is they're a 65-year-old with heart failure, previous smoking history, that means most likely you are going to a heart failure or a COPD or pneumonia. But if I have a young 20-year-old patient who's coming with worsening shortness of breath and let's say joint pain, and the patient is a female, I might think about more rheumatological conditions. And we build this tree throughout our training. I don't need to go extensively through every symptom and ask the patient all the questions because you have a mental tree of efficiency to know what to ask. And the EHR, the billing, led to the division of the exam room. And that also led to the pajama time, where physicians, once they finish work, they go home, and this is something I've done. Every physician who's listening to this episode, they know they've done, is when we go home, the work is not done yet. We still have to document what we have done throughout the day, and this documentation usually doesn't end, and it continues with us even after we go home at 5 or 6 p.m. I can give you an example from my work. Sometimes when I work on the weekend, it could be very busy, and I might see between 20 to 30 patients. Seeing patients, putting orders, following up on them is something I do between 8 a.m. and 12 p.m., like 4 hours. However, after that, I have to document whatever I've done, and that takes me from 12 p.m. until 9 p.m. I spend 9 hours on documentation on the weekend.
So now we're in November of 2022. OpenAI launched ChatGPT, and within 2 months, it had over 100 million users and was considered to have experienced what's called in the startup world as exponential growth. They were classified as the fastest growing consumer application in history. Everyone was playing with it, asking it to write poems and code and explain complex topics. And doctors were playing with it too. They quickly realized this thing can answer medical questions. How well can it answer medical questions, though? Surprisingly well, actually. In early 2023, researchers started testing ChatGPT on medical licensing exams. These are the tests that doctors have to pass to be able to practice medicine. And ChatGPT 3.5 was scoring at or near the passing threshold. Then came ChatGPT 4 a few months later, and it was scoring in the 75th percentile or higher. So it was effectively performing as well as a significant percentage of actual doctors on standardized tests. That's pretty impressive because these aren't easy tests. The questions are complex, they require reasoning across multiple domains of knowledge, and here was ChatGPT 4 performing at a pretty surprising and acceptable level. So you might be wondering, why aren't doctors just using ChatGPT? And some of them are, informally of course, but there are a few major problems. Problem number one was hallucinations. This is a term for when an AI confidently just makes stuff up. In most domains, hallucinations are annoying, but they're not catastrophic, right? If ChatGPT makes up a fact about history or gives you buggy code, that's not great, but more likely than not, nobody's gonna die. But in medicine, a hallucination can kill someone. If an AI tells a doctor that drug A is safe to give with the drug B when it actually causes a dangerous adverse interaction, and the doctor ends up trusting the advice ChatGPT gives, that's a potentially fatal outcome for that patient. And there have been documented cases of ChatGPT giving medical advice, especially dangerous medical advice. A 2023 study found that ChatGPT provided incorrect or potentially harmful information in up to 30% of medical queries. 30%. So that's a pretty clear indicator. Look, you cannot trust this thing reliably in the field of medicine. And it's commonly known that when it comes to practicing medicine, if you can't trust it completely, you cannot use it at all.
And I want to cover here a bit why this matters now. We talked in our previous episodes, we analyzed how different companies launched different products and they worked because the timing was appropriate. Let's break down this. One, technology. What changed on the technology side? The big breakthrough is the transformer models. This is the architecture that powers GPT and most modern AI systems. There was this seminal paper, Attention is All You Need, that was published in 2017 by researchers at Google. What's special about the transformers is, without getting too technical, transformers are really good at understanding context and relationship in text. Previous AI models would process language sequentially, word by word. Transformers can look at the entire context at once and understand how different parts relate to each other, how a heart failure is related to the levels of BMP and the sodium in the blood and the urine output and the levels of JDP, how a specific chemotherapy drug is related to the diarrhea versus an immunotherapy drug is related to diarrhea. Those are two different mechanisms of diarrhea. I'm sure the physicians who are listening to this, they know what I'm talking about. And GPT-3, since it came out in 2020, had 175 billion parameters. Think about parameters as the neurons in the brain. GPT-3 had lots of neurons in the brain, but that was nothing when compared to further models that kept coming like GPT-4, GPT-5, and now we have Claude, we have Gemini. The parameters, the amount of neurons, the cells in the brain of these models is just increasing. And based on research, we know that as you increase the number of these neurons, these models are going to become more knowledgeable. But there is a huge but. We will talk about it when we talk about OpenEvidence. These are general models. They are not trained specifically on medical knowledge. They can answer coding questions. They can answer cooking-related questions. They can answer history-related questions, but they are not trained on medical knowledge.
And I just want to jump in here as well, because this was one of the biggest problems that when doctors originally started using and trying to use ChatGPT in a medical context, the biggest thing that it was lacking, and this is so important in the medical field, was provenance. ChatGPT was not giving you citations, and in medicine, that's a huge problem. Doctors are trained from the very first day they enter medical training to evaluate evidence. And they evaluate evidence based on whether or not the information that they're being presented with, is this information from a large randomized controlled trial, or is it a small observational study? Was it published in a top-tier journal or a sketchy, predatory, pay-to-play type of journal? Even beyond that, is this a recent piece of medical discovery or evidence that has come out, or is it 20 years old now? ChatGPT wasn't giving any of that context. It was a black box. And doctors can't, and in my opinion, shouldn't be using a black box to make clinical decisions.
The second factor that played a role in the adoption of AI, especially in healthcare, is the market readiness. We already talked about the burnout crisis. And again, I'm not a burnout expert. There are so many reasons relate or can contribute to physicians' burnout. Information explosion is one of them. And the Association of American Medical College, according to their latest 2024 report, they project a shortage of 86,000 physicians by 2036. One of the reasons are fewer people are going into it. It took me, from my own experience, 16 years to become an oncologist. If you think about it, I would have done 3 different PhDs. PhD in finance, PhD in computer science, and PhD in math in those 16 years. And I would have acquired many more skills And maybe I could have been richer too. But I think I'm more a nerdy person. I love reading and more than anything else. So less people are going to medicine. The market is ready to adopt tools that help physicians navigate the healthcare information explosion. And then on top of that, there is more technology adoption. COVID was a huge accelerator for telemedicine and technology adoption in general. And you can hear more about COVID and how it affected other companies like Doximity in our previous episode. And also there is a generational shift. Millennials and Gen Z are now the biggest population practicing medicine. 2023 survey found that 75% of physicians under 40 were excited about AI in medicine. And finally, the most important aspect that helped in the explosion of AI in healthcare is
capital readiness. And you might be wondering, okay, why are VCs suddenly interested in medical AI? And the reason for that is that ChatGPT really did change everything. Before November 2022, AI was interesting but niche. You had very, very few companies that were actively trying to develop in the artificial intelligence space. But then, after ChatGPT came along, suddenly every VC firm was now trying to figure out how to invest in AI. And that's why you might have heard it referred to as the AI gold rush. In 2023 alone, AI startups raised over $50 billion, and healthcare was seen as one of the biggest opportunities. Why healthcare specifically? A couple of reasons. One, it is an absolutely massive market that is ripe for technical and technological disruption. US healthcare spending is about $4.5 trillion per year. And so even capturing a tiny fraction of that market is a huge serviceable available market. Secondly, there's this narrative that healthcare is inefficient and, like I mentioned, ripe for disruption. And AI is the perfect disruptor story, right? And a place where you can use technology to do things that previously required highly trained experts. And lastly, the top VCs saw what happened with companies like Stripe and Figma. They went after professional users who would pay for tools that made them dramatically more productive. The PLG model, which is based on product-led growth, is one where, in the case of medicine, you give doctors an amazing tool for free. They tell their colleagues, you get organic viral growth, and then eventually you monetize through institutional licenses or premium features. And this became an incredibly capital-efficient way compared to traditional enterprise sales where you have teams of business development representatives, you have teams of account executives, customer success managers, and the idea of instead being able to lead and sustain your product growth through these word-of-mouth tools and through your users just talking about it to other people in their industry became an opportunity that VCs were eager to hop on. So now you have firms like Sequoia, Google Ventures, Kleiner Perkins, right? The top tier of firms, all hunting for the category winner in medical AI. There's money available. These companies and VC firms are sophisticated enough to underwrite the regulatory and go-to-market complexity, and they see the huge upside. Again, $4.5 trillion is spent every year in the United States on healthcare. So now we have a confluence, right? The technology is ready, the market is ready, the capital is ready. And all three of these needed to be true at the same time. And that's what makes this moment in time that we're living in right now so special. Back in 2015, 10 years ago, the technology just wasn't good enough. In 2020, 5 years ago, the models were getting there, but the market wasn't ready for it yet, and the capital wasn't flowing yet. Now, as we start 2026, we're seeing an arena where all three are aligned. And as we all know, the most successful VCs, the ones that are able to leverage the power law to their advantage the greatest, are the ones that are able to get in early. So Well, right now, the models that exist out there are all very, very high quality. They're all able to perform very, very well. Back in 2023, 3 years ago, even though the models might not have been as advanced as they are now, even though the market might not have been as ready as it is now, some of the top VCs got together and realized, hey, there's a company that is being created out there right now that will be perfectly primed in a few years' time to capture this burgeoning healthcare market.
And this company was OpenEvidence. Now, we're going to talk how OpenEvidence started. I would say, let's imagine it's around 2017 to 2019. We will talk about how the co-founders of OpenEvidence met. But before going into the details, we have to talk about Zachary Ziegler. Zachary grew up outside of Boston. He taught himself to program in middle school, not through formal classes, but because he loved playing video games and wanted to figure out how they worked. He made mods for Skyrim and other games, building things from scratch out of pure curiosity. He is just like someone who liked to put things together. Ziegler's undergrad degree was in physics. He applied to top PhD programs in the country, and he was accepted everywhere. But during those interviews, something clicked. He realized that a career in physics wasn't what he wanted. He had been evaluating potential labs from physics perspective, thinking about what his daily life would look like in each one of them, and he came to understand that the work simply wasn't enjoyable for him. What he really found to be enjoyable is what he spent all his free time doing. It was computer science and AI work. So in 2018, Zachary pivoted and he started his PhD at Harvard in machine learning, working specifically on probabilistic generative models with Alexander Rush. At that time, academia was the most insider place where the secrets of AI were being developed. This is before OpenAI and Anthropic became the dominant forces that they are today. And for our listeners who don't know who Alexander or Sasha Rush is, he's one of the most influential NLP researchers of his generation and Zachary Ziegler's PhD advisor at Harvard. He's currently associate professor at Cornell Tech and Cornell's Bowers College of Computing. He's a researcher at Hugging Face and is also a member of Cornell's Natural Language Processing group. So Ziegler comes out of Harvard's computer science and AI research community. This isn't an MBA who took Python courses. This is someone who spent years in the trenches of machine learning research, reading papers, implementing algorithms, training models, debugging neural networks at 2 a.m. The specifics of how Zachary and Daniel met goes back to Kensho. Remember, Nadler did his PhD in Harvard as well as Zachary. Ziegler was mentoring a Harvard undergrad student who was connected to the coding scene. One day, that student turned to Ziegler and said, "There is this totally amazing guy who is really interested in doing some stuff commercially with generative modeling. You should totally meet him." And Zachary Ziegler, as a student, was part of the coding community that used to go to Kensho. And that's where the connection between those two started. Ziegler and Nadler met, and they started talking about how to make generative models actually useful, not just producing pretty images or sentences, approximate English, but doing things that really genuinely matter in the world.
When considering where to apply their work, healthcare stood out for two reasons to Daniel and Zachary. First, as Ziegler puts it, healthcare is the thing that is the most impactful place you can have an impact in the entire world because it's so central to the experience of just being a human. But the second reason was even more compelling. It was also the area that had the biggest delta between the potential to have impact and the state of the art at the time. They were absolutely shocked, and I would say quite disappointed too, that WebMD was the standard for consumer health information. These are Zachary's own words, but He said, "It is just such a terrible resource. And not only is it so bad, it is almost criminal how bad it is compared to how enormous the amount of knowledge that we know is. We spend trillions and trillions of dollars doing research and learning incredible things. The sticking point increasingly is that there's now all this stuff that exists, and making all that stuff accessible was really the challenge."
As we mentioned earlier, in 2018, S&P Global acquired Kensho Technologies for $550 million. We don't know exact Nadler's ownership stake, but let's do the math approximately. Kensho raised about $70 million in venture capital, the typical founder dilution pattern. Nadler probably owned somewhere between 15 to 30% at exit. Even at conservative end, that's around like $82 million after taxes, let's say around 50-ish to 70-ish million dollars liquid. And that's a bootstrap capital. In 2021, when Nadler and Ziegler decided to start OpenEvidence, they made a critical strategic choice. Don't raise venture capital immediately. Self-fund the initial development. The company was formally incorporated as Xylo Inc. in Delaware, the standard choice for tech startups due to their business-friendly corporate laws. They set up headquarters. Initially, it was in Cambridge, Massachusetts, close to Harvard's and MIT's AI research ecosystem, where Ziegler had done his PhD work. Later, the company moves to Miami, Florida in summer 2024, part of a broader tech migration from the Boston area. But in those early days, Cambridge made sense. The proximity to top AI talent, the Harvard-MIT Medical School Network, and Boston Biotech Corridor. Why does this matter? Because it gives them three massive advantages. One, they don't have time pressure. When you raise capital from VC, you are on a clock. Investors are expecting progress in 12 to 18 months. They want metrics, they want growth, they want revenue trajectory, they want this, they want that, and you are again in fundraising mode. You're always praying for your next round. You're always managing investors' updates. You're calling this, you're calling that, you're emailing this, you're emailing that. But by self-funding, Nadler gave himself and Ziegler a breathing room. They could spend a year just figuring out the product, what doctors really want, and how should AI architecture look like? What content partnerships they are essential? These are hard questions that require experimentation, prototyping, and talking to hundreds of physicians. When you are spending your own money you already earned, you can take your sweet time.
The second reason why they did not, and in my opinion made the right decision not to go out and raise VC funds, was because of something that most founders overlook or don't realize when it comes to venture capital firms. When you're pitching VCs, you have to tell a story they understand. You have to fit into a category. You have to have a clear business model, ideally with revenue and with traction. But sometimes the right product doesn't fit into a nice, neat narrative you can tie with a bow at the top. And OpenEvidence's core insight was that doctors need AI they can trust, which means citations, epistemic humility, training exclusively on peer-reviewed literature. And you'll hear it time and time again, and I've heard this from VCs as well, where they will tell you, hey, don't go out and build for VCs, build the right product. And as much as VCs may love saying that, at the end of the day, what ends up happening is you might go to them with the right product, but they don't end up funding you because they don't understand it. You're not hitting their business model expectations, your TAM expectations, or even your traction expectations. What Nadler and Ziegler did here was, in my opinion, a bit of a genius move. They basically said, look, we might not have any of this figured it out, and we may not be what's widely considered to be in a fundable state by VCs, but we know that we want to build the right product, and it's more important to us to build the right product over building a fundable product. And in 2021, 2022, the obvious VC pitch might have been, hey, we're building ChatGPT for healthcare. And this was even at a time when ChatGPT in its modern form didn't exist yet. And the first question I guarantee you VCs would have asked them was, how are you going to monetize this? And Nadler would have to say, we're making this free for doctors. We won't monetize for years. We're going to build trust first. And the VCs would have given them the same answer they give to most companies at the end of the day. Thanks for coming by. Check in back with us later once you've actually built it. The pitch they never had to make is what made them be so defensible and so strong first, because they could focus on building the right product where they did the right thing when it comes to building healthcare. You have to build trust first. And that might have been a hard pitch before the AI gold rush. And so by self-funding, Nadler didn't have to convince anyone. He could just go out and build what would actually get used by physicians, even if the business model wasn't crystal clear yet.
Raising money in healthcare is very hard. And it's not only like Nadler or someone else might struggle in it. Even VCs in general don't like to invest in healthcare. There was an interview with Peter Thiel, one of the biggest venture capitalists or VCs in the Bay Area. And Peter Thiel himself say there are two areas that he won't invest in. One is in healthcare. Two is in education. Because in healthcare, your user is not your payer is not your user. And those are two different things. Understanding where the payment come from is very difficult. And then on top of that, the sales cycle in healthcare is very long. The third reason Nadler didn't raise money at the beginning, because now he knows what he's doing. Remember, he already built and sold an AI company in a very complex, heavily regulated industry for $500 million. He knows the playbook. He knows how to start with a hard technical problem, build the best solution, not the fastest solution. He knows how to get adoption from sophisticated users. He knows how to scale the product. He knows how to monetize later through enterprise sales. He has done this before. And remember, Kensho was acquired for $500 million on a $20 million income. So probably they were breaking it even. They didn't have lots of income, but the technology was very important. And Ziegler was doing the same thing here with OpenEvidence. He was building the technical foundation. He didn't just fine-tune an existing model on some custom retrieval system to make the model retrieve some questions or answers depending on a specific prompt or a query. No. He was building a foundation technology bottom up. By mid-2022, they probably had some prototype that worked well, enough to show physicians and to get meaningful feedback. And that's where they started playing big. They started getting big names under their belt. And here comes Mayo Clinic, the platform accelerator.
Now, while Ziegler was busy building a robust and reliable technical foundation for the company, Nadler was equally busy on negotiating content partnerships. Here's the problem every healthcare startup faces. Physicians are skeptical, and rightfully so. For decades, they've been sold software that was supposed to make their lives easier, like EHRs, billing systems, clinical decision support, and almost all of it, by and large, has been garbage. Clunky interfaces built for administrators and insurance companies and not for doctors. And in almost all cases, the software has always added work instead of reducing it. So when a new startup comes onto the scene and says, hey, we've built an AI that's going to help you practice better medicine, the default response for most physicians is, sure, get in line with the other 500 companies that have made me the exact same process. How does a founder overcome that skepticism? The best way is by building strong institutional partnerships. And part of the pathway of getting there is getting the endorsements by an institution physicians already trust, an institution with unimpeachable clinical credibility, an institution that's been around for over 150 years and is synonymous worldwide with medical excellence. You get endorsed by the Mayo Clinic. Now, Mayo Clinic's platform Accelerate isn't a typical startup accelerator. This isn't Y Combinator, this isn't Techstars, this isn't we give you $120K for 7% equity and you pitch us on demo day. Mayo Clinic Platform Accelerate is a clinical innovation program. It's designed specifically for healthcare companies that need clinical validation. And it's for companies that need access to real physicians in real clinical settings. They need to prove their product actually works before they can scale. Now, the program is highly, highly selective, and I've been rejected from it before as well, because they typically accept 8 to 10 companies per cohort, and they're looking for companies solving real clinical problems with strong technical foundations, led by people who understand healthcare. And an interesting tidbit I can give you about them is that if anyone listening is ever thinking about applying to them, you must absolutely have a data scientist on your team. Otherwise, they will not be interested in working with you and talking with you. They take the approach to data science very, very seriously for all companies that they work with. Anyways, back to OpenEvidence. Based off of our research, it looks like they graduated from the Mayo Clinic Accelerator platform around July 2023, and they were part of the third cohort of health tech startups. Now, of course, there were other startups that are with them, as this accelerator is an immersive 20-week program. So it balances out to taking about 5 to 6 months to go through the program.
And I can add a couple of points here is what Mayo Clinic provides. First, they provide clinical validation. OpenEvidence got access to Mayo Clinic physicians, oncologists, cardiologists, primary care doctors. This is one of the bottlenecks in innovation in healthcare. If you're creating an Instagram-like platform, you can just go and talk to people and you can message people. Let's say if you're creating a machine learning model or a product in Stanford, you can just go on campus and talk to people on campus and record people and do like direct one-to-one user interviews. It does not apply to healthcare. If you're creating a product where your user is physician, it's so hard to talk to your user and get feedback and improve your product. It's very impossible to get that very busy creature to talk to you for 30 minutes on a Zoom meeting or something and give you feedback. They don't even, with all respect, with lots of physicians, me included, but lots of physicians don't even understand technology. They don't know what you are looking for. Mayo Clinic provides clinical validation. And when you see a product that went through Mayo Clinic Accelerator, you say, okay, they know what they are doing because they provide the physician, the clinical guidance, the user of the product. As you see, this is something that comes in the playbook of successful healthcare companies. And the second thing that Mayo Clinic provides is clinical research. Beyond user experience and user testing, Mayo Clinic provides research credibility. In April 2025, actually, Mayo researchers published a paper titled The Use of Artificial Intelligence Platform OpenEvidence to Augment Clinical Decision-Making for Primary Care Physicians. The study was small. They just had 5 patient case analyzed retrospectively, but it used real-life clinical scenarios. And having physicians do research on your product and publish their results, it's a big thing. Publishing a paper, oh my God, it's a hassle. It takes so much time from data collection, doing the statistical analysis, writing the paper, asking the authors to review this paper, and then putting everything together, going to a journal, submitting the paper, the journal getting back to you by rejection or approval with reviewer comments, answering their comments, submitting the paper back, and then go through this process. Usually it takes you a year. Like, it's not easy process to publish a paper. And then on top of all this, you have to pay thousands of dollars to publish a paper. You can create a YouTube video and upload it for free, but to publish a paper and a research that you've done with your sweat and your tears, you have to pay between $3,000 to $4,000 to publish a PDF article somewhere. So it's very hard, and Mayo Clinic helps with that. So when it comes to partnering up with institutions, it's not always about the money and the funding. There are partnerships in healthcare that provide much more than that. Provide marketing by having the right brand, by having the research output, and also provide connection and user feed. And that's how partnerships like this make a difference in the life cycle of a health tech company. After we talked on how and why they self-funded, let's talk about what they built. OpenEvidence is not like GPT and Gemini and Claude. It's not like their main goal is to increase the number of parameters and like go to trillions and trillions of parameters and build bigger and bigger models. It's very different. Here is a critical insight. Open evidence, they focus on smaller, specialized models trained on domain-specific data. And it's shown through research, and there are so many publications out there, that these models outperform large general models for specialized applications. Think about it this way. GPT-4 knows a little bit about everything. Cooking, poetry, physics, love, medicine, sports, video games. It's a generalist. But open evidence models know medicine deeply. The models are domain-specific. They are trained exclusively on medical literature. They are fine-tuned, optimized for medical terminology, clinical reasoning, treatment protocols, citation length. Every generated answer or every generated sentence must be traceable to a source document. And retrieval augmented. That means that the system retrieves relevant papers first, synthesizes an answer based on what it found. And this dramatically reduces hallucinations. This is called DRAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. It's a generation that is augmented by retrieval. And instead of model trying to remember everything it learned during its training, it searches a database for an actual paper in real time, and it retrieves the most relevant ones and generates an answer based on what it just found. This architecture makes hallucinations much harder. The model can't make up something because it has to point to the actual source document. And here is where open evidence does something revolutionary. If the literature is inconclusive or contradictory, the system says no. It refuses to give a confident answer when the evidence doesn't support one. Example, let's take an example. If a doctor asks, should I use drug X or drug Y on a rare condition Z in pregnant patients? If there isn't enough evidence, the system will tell you the current medical literature doesn't provide a sufficient evidence to recommend X over Y in pregnant patients. What they really focus on their answers is they tell you how an answer is written, and they allow you as a physician to decide if you want to take this into account or no. And then the other thing is citation is everything in their answers. And now in this day and age, this is something we see in most of the AI clinical, or let's say all of the AI clinical decision support tools. Every answer is supported by citation. Every factual claim in open evidence answer includes a citation in the source paper. It's not at the end, it is buried in a footnote. It's in line, it's with the sentence. If they tell you, like, for example, for a stage 3 non-small cell lung cancer with PD-L1 more than 50%, pembrolizumab monotherapy showed superior progression-free survival, and then boom, they give you Keynote 024, New England Journal of Medicine 2016. That means that this fact came from the study Keynote 024 in New England Journal of Medicine 2016. So every fact is supported by citations. And when you have citations, a physician can verify a claim, can click on the citation, go to the paper where the evidence came from, and they can evaluate the strength of the evidence. It means if a study was done on 1,000 patients, it's very different from a case series or like someone writing about 10 patients. When you have an evidence or a knowledge that is generated by studying 1,000 patients, you will have stronger truth, or let's say stronger evidence on how to treat a specific condition. And a physician can also dive deeper if they want more details. And again, this is in this day and age, open evidence is not the only one who's doing this. Other AI clinical decision support tools, they provide this. But open evidence, I would say they had the first mover advantage.
Now, the important thing to remember when it comes to these citations, and especially when it comes to retrieval augmented generation, is that RAG systems are great at reducing hallucinations, but they are not foolproof because The quality of the output depends heavily on the quality of the input here. And so if your retrieval augmented generation is connected to a knowledge store of inaccurate or poor quality data, then the output you get from the model that's pulling against that data will be equally subpar because it all depends on the quality of the data. And that's where OpenAI's data strategy is so incredibly critical to their ability to perform the way that they do. Most AI systems are trained by scraping the internet. They ingest billions of web pages, social media posts, Wikipedia articles, pretty much everything that's openly accessible on the internet. OpenEvidence doesn't do that. Instead, they license content directly from the most prestigious medical publishers in the world. Some of these publishers you may have heard of, like the New England Journal of Medicine, which is probably the most prestigious medical journal on earth. Then you have JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. You have the NCCN guidelines, which are the gold standard for cancer treatment protocols, as well as more than 35 million peer-reviewed medical publications from PubMed and other databases. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter so much? As I mentioned earlier, quality control, right? Only peer-reviewed research is used in the retrieval augmented generation process. No blog posts, no crazy medical
Reddit.
Yeah, no crazy medical Reddit, no misinformation sources. Everything that they're pulling from is from peer-reviewed research. And because doctors recognize and trust these sources that I just mentioned, when OpenEvidence cites the New England Journal of Medicine, doctors know that that's legitimate. Another key part of this is legality, right? We've already seen companies like OpenAI, like NVIDIA, engage in court proceedings because they do not respect copyright issues. OpenEvidence is taking, in my opinion, and Rupen, you might agree with this as well, they're taking the most ethical approach when it comes to licensing data, right? They're actively seeking permission and establishing partnerships with the holders and the owners of this data so that they can make sure that their model is presenting reliable information and they're getting that information in an ethical manner as well.
I want to add one point here to the reader who doesn't know what peer review or reviewed means. And the way the publication process works is, as a researcher, we look into a problem. Let's say we're going to look into patients' response to a specific drug. And we start collecting data. We give some patients drug A and other patients, they get a drug B. And then we see the response of patients who is doing better on which drug. We put these numbers into, let's say, an Excel sheet. And after a year or two, we analyze our data. We see who lived longer and who lived shorter. After that, we write these findings into a paper and then we submit it to a journal. But that is not the ground of truth. Now the journal will take our data, will take the paper that we've written, and then will distribute it to other experts in the field, between 4 to 5 other experts, whom I don't know as a researcher, and they don't know me. And I would say the reviewers of the paper, they might know me because they have access to the paper and sometimes also like the names of the authors, but most journals try to reduce bias by not allowing the people who submit the paper knowing who are the people reviewing this paper and vice versa. So there is a blinding in between, and that helps to reduce bias, unconscious bias, where you might agree with someone if you know them. And the medical journal removes that aspect. And this is the process of peer review. As we go through the process, the other 4 or 5 reviewers will look at this paper and they will send comments to the journal. The journal is the third party here, will take these comments and send them back to the writers and tell them, hey, you got these comments from the reviewers. The writers are going to respond to these comments, send them back to the journal. The journal, again, will take these comments, send them to the reviewers. The reviewers will send these comments back to the journal and back and forth until they reach an agreement where this paper and the data makes sense. This is the process of peer review. On average, it takes 2 to 3 months, if not more or less, to review a paper. And that's what means evidence-based approach from peer-reviewed articles. Lots of patients, and I know I'm going to get a huge pushback on this and people might not like what I'm saying, but I have some patients who come and tell me they want to take, for example, ivermectin or mebendazole to treat their cancer. Because like they read on Reddit or someone posted on X or Twitter that this drug helps to treat cancer. And I tell them that this doesn't work. There isn't any peer-reviewed. If this drug works, the company itself would do this peer review process and do research and publish journals about it. But the drug doesn't work for this cancer because there is no evidence, because it doesn't work, and there is no peer-reviewed literature on it. So when we say peer-reviewed, as you heard me talking about it, it's a very long process to make sure that the data is accurate.
And this process it does sound quite long, but it's long on purpose and it's long for a reason, so that and so physicians are never in a position where they're having to act on or add to their medical knowledge databases in their brains information that can potentially form harm or pose the threat of harm to their patients. Because, as we all know, one of the key rules that doctors live by is do no harm. And the peer review process does play a core role in doctors being able to get access to high quality information. Now, OpenEvidence's model architecture combined with their data strategy, in addition to the way that they treat citations, all come together in the late summer of 2025. And it comes together in a way that sends shockwaves through the medical AI community. On August 15th, 2025, OpenEvidence makes an announcement that they had become the first AI system in history to score a perfect 100% on the United States medical licensing examination. Let me tell you what that means. The USMLE is the standardized test that every physician in America must pass to get their medical license. It's a 3-step exam covering basic science, clinical knowledge, and clinical skills. And it's hard. Medical students spend months studying for it. Not everybody passes on their first attempt. Previously, OpenEvidence had been the first AI to score over 90% on the USMLE. Now, that was already impressive, better than many human doctors. And regardless of what your feelings are on the USMLE, I'm looking at you, Rupen.
I'm holding myself. I will jump in, but I'm waiting for you to finish.
Regardless of what your feelings may be on the USMLE, it is still the standardized test that is in use today in the United States. And scoring a perfect score on it is, aside from just being impressive, it's a form of validation. It demonstrates that the system doesn't just retrieve information, it understands medicine. It can reason through complex clinical scenarios. It can apply knowledge across domains, and it can do a differential diagnosis. And from there, it can select appropriate treatments based on patient-specific factors. And most critically, it teaches reasoning. The system doesn't just say, this is the answer. It explains why, if the answer is option B, this is why B is correct, what is the evidence to support that, and why the other options are wrong. And it does all of this with accurate references.
All right, so now it's my turn. You heard Sam, his perspective. I have to give you my perspective. And we're not going to cut actually any of the parts that we're recording because literally this is what happens in real life and different people have different views on this. I know that not only OpenEvidence, there are so many AI clinical decision support tools out there that use the USMLE as a benchmark. The USMLE, it's the United States Medical Licensing Exam, and whoever uses this as a benchmark, unfortunately, in my opinion, it's wrong. You can't use this as a benchmark, but it's one of the clinical benchmarks out there that is known to a wide range of people that makes sense to a big number of people. That's why this benchmark. Let's talk about the United States Medical Licensing Exam. It's an exam that a medical student has to take during their studies in medical school before starting residency. Residency is when you treat patients in real life. And medical school is what you read in the textbook. So you read textbooks and then you prepare for the USMLEs. And the reason there is an S at the end of the USMLE is because it's a 3-step exam. You have a step 1, you have a step 2, and you have step 3. Step 1 is test the user on basic knowledge. That means like biochemistry, anatomy. These are sciences that help you to understand clinical sciences. They don't help you to treat patients, but they lay the ground on helping the physician to understand how diseases interact with each other and how medications interact with each other. Then we have the step 2, which is the more clinical exam, where we ask the students questions on how to treat a medical condition or what to do or what investigation test to order on a specific patient. Then we have a step 3, which is the more complex than a step 2, but also focus on clinical reasoning. Student has to take step 1 and step 2 during their medical school, and then apply to residency. And then in residency, they usually take the step 3. In residency is where the learning happens, the real life learning happens on how to treat patients. Whatever you learn in medical school, really only it's like 10% helpful for you to navigate residency. And in residency, you gain you learn the tricks and you learn how to treat patients in real life, because patients in real life, they are very different than patients in textbook. And this isn't in textbooks. The patients in real life, they are very unique. Textbook teaches you how to approach a specific condition. However, patients in real life comes with 5 conditions. If you do math, it's just like probability. You're not only calculating the probability of an outcome, you're also calculating the probability of a conditional outcome depending on previous probability or conditions that happened. So long story short, I like OpenEvidence, don't get me wrong, but I think using the USMLE as a benchmark is not correct here. And of course, we have different opinions. That doesn't mean if someone or a person or an AI scores high on the USMLE, they will be able to treat real life patients. This does not translate to clinical reasoning in real life. And the other thing is, of course, that's not the case in OpenEvidence, because OpenEvidence was trained on PubMed. If you take ChatGPT, was trained on all the literature out there, including Reddit, right? Including sub-forums and forums where medical students discuss the questions that are USMLE related, and they discuss the correct answers of these questions. So when a ChatGPT or other model like Gemini or Claude or Anthropic, they are trained on the same data that is being used on testing that. So the test is retrieval more than reasoning. And that's why we wanted Sam and I to record this from different perspective, because some people might have Sam's perspective and some physicians might have my perspective, but we have to know that the USMLE is not the optimal benchmark.
All that to say that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, even though the 100% score wasn't just a technical achievement, right? I also feel like it was a marketing moment for OpenEvidence, because doctors might approach this and think, look, this AI passed the same tests that I took and it scored higher than I did. Maybe, just maybe, I should think about trusting it. But if we get really into it now, especially I find the numbers to be very, very interesting here. And we open this episode with this as well. It's the growth that OpenEvidence has gone through. In July 2024, they had 358,000 physician consultations in a single month. A year later, July 2025, they had 358,000 consultations in a single day.
But I want to emphasize one point here, because I tried to search online and find what is the definition of a consultation. Are they defining consultation by a question asked by a physician to OpenEvidence AI, or it's a use of their AI Scribe tool? Because as we're going to listen and we're going to talk about like other tools OpenEvidence launched, I think that definition is not very obvious to me. And I just wanted to clarify that point.
Yeah, it's one of the things that, based off of the research group that I did, and, we conduct over 50 hours of research into every episode that we produce. But this was one of those things that we're not 100% sure about. But assuming that it is the questions that a physician is asking of the open evidence model, it points to about 30 times growth in 1 year. And if you look at the numbers as of, the summer of 2025, you have a little over 400,000 physicians that are using the platform, which equates to about 40% of all US doctors. There's more than 10,000 hospitals and medical centers that are using open evidence, and they're experiencing about 65,000 new registrations per month. Now, it's important to remember with open evidence as well that the only people that are able to get access to it are those with an NPI. So that means doctors, nurse practitioners, PAs, basically to be a healthcare practitioner, to be able to get access to it. So these 65,000 registrations per month are verified clinician registrations. And as of middle of 2025, they were experiencing about 17 million questions per month from practicing physicians. That's a level of adoption faster than any healthcare technology in history, except for the iPhone. And you might be wondering, why are doctors, the user group that is notoriously slow to adopt new technology, flocking to this tool?
About the reasons why this is a huge adoption. There are several things we have to understand about open evidence, and we have to understand physician psychology. We have to understand user behavior. First, I think it's very obvious. It's free. Open evidence is completely free for physicians. There is no subscription fee, no usage limits, no freemium upsell. It's just like free. This removes all friction because your biggest technology adopter are usually, those are the young physicians, the residents and the medical students. A resident on average makes $60,000 a year, which it sounds okay, but it's not a lot. Taking into consideration an average resident, they will have between $200,000 to $400,000 in debt during their residency because they paid for medical expenses, their medical studies, their living expenses, and all these things. So they will have lots of debt. And residents are less likely to spend money on clinical decision support tools. But remember, those are the early adopters, and then they adopt a tool, they will more likely become an users or permanent users in the future, because the stickiness, it's a big thing in healthcare. If you can get people to stick to your product, it becomes a brand name and people won't switch or less likely to switch. Residents make around $60,000 a year, which can use the same tool as an attending who makes like $500,000 a year. And the rural family in Montana have the same access to the tool like an oncologist in Memorial Sloan Kettering. Free means universal, and universal means like there is network effect. Every doctor tells their colleagues and they each tell each other. And here we see the exponential growth. And this is something also we've seen when it comes to other companies. For example, Doximity, they had also exponential growth when they started in 2010. The second thing, it's fast. So you want an answer, you go, and instead of reading like 40 articles from UpToDate or PubMed, and again, I'm not putting any of these tools down. I don't have any conflict of interest with any of these companies, but I'm just comparing the methods. If you go and read a full article, that's going to take you so much time to find an answer. Here, you can just find an answer by prompting the AI. And especially right now, physicians are very pressed for time. On average, physicians spend 15 minutes with patients and then maybe less between patients. And it's very overwhelming process to just sit down and find answers between patients. So if you can find an answer while you are with the patient and while you are between patients, that will make your life much easier. Open evidence AI answer is quick. When you ask a question, you will get an answer summarized from different resources within, I would say, 3 to 5 seconds, depending on the complexity of the question. And the accuracy part, it's important. I would say it's accurate. I have not looked into research that has been done on open evidence tool, benchmarking their accuracy when compared to other tools. I'm aware of the USMLE benchmark, and I talked about the USMLE benchmark, but I would say it's accurate and it earns physicians' trust. And sometimes there are some posts I see on LinkedIn here and there that people are like catching some inaccuracies, which still happen because there are 5,000 ways to skin a cat. The same comes to treating a cancer. Sometimes there are 2, 3 ways of treating a cancer, approaching cancer, especially in the second or third line treatment, or approaching a disease. And it really depends on the source literature is being used. And that's why I'm a big user for all these the clinical decision support tools. And I like to use them as a second consultants, whether it's OpenEvidence, whether it's Doximity, whether it's UpToDate or other tools. So I love to use them as consultants, and they are really good. Each tool has its own unique capabilities. And then the fourth and the last thing, it's the approach has changed a lot. Where I would say before the last thing, OpenEvidence, they went directly to physicians, and it's a bottom-up approach. Right now, if we look at the market, if we look at the AI Scribe market, if we look at the clinical decision support tools, most of them are doing this, where they go directly to the physician, and then when physicians likes the tool, they go bottom up, they go and talk to an institution, CIO or CMO, and they say like, hey, you have X amount of users in your institution who are using our tools. Let's do a partnership, or let's try to do something specific for your institution. Right now, it looks very like straightforward, direct, but this was not the case before 2022. Before 2022, you as a physician are always under the mercy of your employer, depending on what tools they would buy. And if it fits the budget or not, you have to stick with these tools. If your employer buys, for example, Epic as an EMR, you have to stick with it versus Cerner as an EMR. If your employer, for example, gives you UpToDate, you can use it, but you still can buy it on your own. If your employer buys an AI Scribe, you will use it or not. So before 2022, you always, as a physician, you have to do what the boss is saying to do. But after 2022, with the boom of the AI Scribe market, things has changed drastically. And now lots of physicians, they can go and access not only OpenEvidence, tons of AI Scribe tools. There are lots of AI Scribe tools that are direct to a physician. And I want to expand here a bit on some important aspects. Is this approach, I was talking to a lawyer last time, and this approach might not be liked by lots of institutions because it could be a double-edged sword. At one point, if the tool is being used for a clinical decision support only and you don't have any patient information, yes, institutions, they don't usually have a problem with that. But if we go back or if we go beyond the clinical decision support and we start talking about the AI Scribe, where there is an encounter being recorded between physician and patient, and a physician accesses this tool and use it, and then not only OpenEvidence, any other player comes and talks to a CIO or a CMO, they might not like that. Again, it's one of the possibilities that things might happen because they will say, oh, like you played this behind our back, and then you let our users upload data from our institution to your servers. There is that aspect too. But the bottom-up approach, it's been used by many other players in this field, including OpenEvidence, including Doximity, including Heidi, including lots of AI Scribe tools. But there are so many AI Scribe tools that go directly to institutions. For example, Abridge, they had direct to physician AI Scribe tool, and now they switched to only institution subscription model. And we will talk about this when we talk about the HIPAA rules. And then finally is why there is this huge adoption. It makes people's job better. And when me as a physician, I see a patient, no matter what, I might do some misses right and left. I might miss a blood work that I didn't see, or I'm not aware of a recent clinical trial, phase 1 or phase 2 clinical trial that offers an evidence about treating my patient with a specific drug, especially if they are like on 4th or 5th line of their treatment. I don't have many options according to the guidelines. Navigating the literature using AI tools has been great because you can just go and ask what are like phase 2 or phase 1 clinical trials about treating a patient with XYZ cancer who progress on XYZ treatment. Are there any drugs are being investigated in this setting? And you can't just ask this in PubMed, but OpenEvidence, Doximity, UpToDate. I'm not sure about UpToDate's AI, but AI clinical decision support tools, they are really helpful to make your job better. And as a physician, and this is my own opinion, does not reflect my employer's opinion, or it's my opinion, medicine without an AI assistant is considered under the standard of care. You should always have that second eye or second help to go and find literature or things to support you and even augment your skills as a physician. If you have an AI that runs ambiently in the EMR that catches things that we might miss or notifies us for investigations that we might miss, that's how medicine should be practiced.
I just want to touch on quickly one of the reasons that you mentioned here around that's contributed heavily to their success is around their accuracy. And to me, I think one of the things that every person building in healthcare artificial intelligence should really try and remember is this idea of epistemic humility. For those that don't know what epistemic humility means, the textbook definition is, in essence, right, the habit of recognizing the limits of your own knowledge and being genuinely open to the idea that you might be wrong or that you might be missing context. And in plain language or plain English, it really just boils down to you being able to say, I care about the truth more than being right. And in our conversations with, senior technical executives at OpenEvidence, this was really highlighted by them multiple times that they would rather OpenEvidence come back and say, I don't know the answer, rather than just making up an answer. And I think any AI's ability to do that plays a critical role in whether a physician will be able or will be comfortable in trusting a piece of technology. Because at a certain point in time, just as a doctor might have to at certain points too, right? They might just have to say, I don't know the answer to this question. And so rather than just making something up or telling you based off of the limited context that I know, I'm going to go and find out more information and then I'll come back to you. And the fact that OpenEvidence has built their platform and built their artificial intelligence logic from the ground up to say that it's more important that you present factual and evidence-based truths than just producing an output if it doesn't meet the high quality standards that they have in place. Based off of where we're at, right, OpenEvidence has set up this amazing team. They've developed this incredibly strong technical architecture, and they're well on the way of building physician trust and gaining a substantial amount of US physicians using their platform.
If you're enjoying this deep dive on OpenEvidence, you should know that PMWC 2026, the Precision Medicine World Conference, is happening in March 4th through 6th in Santa Clara. 25 years of precision medicine, co-hosted by Stanford, UCSF, and Yale. The speaker lineup is unreal. Greg Brockman, Carl June, Vinod Khosla, James Su, and even Zachary Ziegler, the co-founder of OpenEvidence, and 12 tracks covering everything from AI drug discovery to clinical genomics. Use code DeltaHealth at checkout and go to the PMWC website, and I will see you there.
Now let's switch gears a little bit and look at their funding roadmap and, where they got to where they are today. And at the time of recording this, they've recently announced a $250 million investment, valuing them at just around $12 billion. But let's go all the way back to February 2025, where OpenEvidence doesn't have a lot of press. There's not a lot of, a hype cycle around this company. They just have hundreds of thousands of doctors using this platform, opening the app every day and trusting it with some of the hardest questions in medicine. And then everything changes. On February 19th, 2025, OpenEvidence drops a press release that stops the health tech world cold. They just announced a $75 million Series A led by the one and only Sequoia Capital, and post-Series A, it values them at $1 billion. And that's $1 billion on their first institutional round. And so far, this is a company that has been entirely self-funded. So no pre-seed, no seed round. They've self-funded this through Daniel Nadler's contribution from his Kensho exit, as well as friends and family round. And effectively, overnight, after this investment by Sequoia, they're now a unicorn. But the one thing that made the kind of startup world and venture world lose their minds a little bit was that OpenEvidence to this point had zero revenue. Their product was completely free, not a freemium model or a pay to play later, or not even a free trial. It was completely free. So the question comes about, how do you justify a billion-dollar valuation on what is effectively, by and large, a free product? And to understand that, we have to go back to the organization that funded their Series A, which was Sequoia. Sequoia led this deal because Sequoia doesn't chase deals, right? They have enough clout in the industry, they have enough respect in the industry to be able to pick which deals they want to go after, right? They invested in Apple, Google, WhatsApp, Stripe. And so when Sequoia writes a check, it is very much so a signal to the entire VC ecosystem and the market at large. And Pat Grady, one of Sequoia's partners, was the champion behind this investment. And his thesis or justification behind investing in OpenEvidence was that this is going to be the AI platform for healthcare, not an AI platform, the platform. And the reasoning behind, thesis that he put forward was around, you have to think about what OpenEvidence had accomplished. By the time their Series A came around, they had hundreds of thousands of verified doctors across more than 10,000 care centers in the United States. And if you do the math, that's roughly around 25% of all practicing physicians in America and about 250,000 doctors or so that were using this thing every single day. And remember as well, all of this was organic product-led growth, right? Doctors telling doctors. And Sequoia saw what was happening and understood something crucial. Adoption velocity like this doesn't really come along very often. When a product spreads through a professional community this fast without any external push, you're looking at something that really truly meets the requirements for product market fit. And the kind of fit that OpenEvidence had created for themselves isn't something that can be manufactured.
And they throw a big bombshell after all this. They are after big names. They were able to establish a partnership with the New England Journal of Medicine. So to our listeners who don't know what the New England Journal of Medicine is, let me explain this. The New England Journal of Medicine is not just like a medical journal. It is the medical journal. This journal was founded in 1812. 2 centuries of publishing the most important research in medicine. When a clinical trial changes how we treat cancer or like how we treat heart disease, it gets published in the New England Journal of Medicine, NAJM. It is the gold standard. It is the final word. Publishing there, a paper goes through an extensive process, looking at the data, making sure everything is accurate, and every paper gets published there usually changes how we practice medicine. They partnered with New England Journal of Medicine, and what New England Journal of Medicine said that we trust OpenEvidence enough to integrate our content into their platform. And this partnership, it looks to me a bit similar to Google's partnership with New York Times. Google had a partnership to help surface their content into a user. So the content is there, but Google was the medium that linked the content to the user. And here, this is the same thing OpenEvidence is trying to do. OpenEvidence idea, their philosophy is like, we're not going to create a content. We are going to create a very good damn AI that is able to find physicians' answers in the literature. And then we will bring the answers as it is written to the physician. Journals do what they are best at doing. Journals are really good at finding the right papers, the evidence that changes how we practice medicine, and publishing it. But us, we will bring this evidence to the user by just like typing a question, because no matter who you are, no matter how avid reader you are, you can't just go read the New England Journal of Medicine publications. Like, it's a huge journal. They have more than tons of sections where they have a section for cardiology, they have a section for oncology, they have section, and things that happen For example, a paper gets published in cardiology, it might affect my field or practice as an oncologist, because if it's a clinical trial, let's say about a specific drug that is being used in cancer, and this cancer, or let's say vice versa, let's say it's a treatment for a heart failure, and one of my drugs as an oncologist can lead to heart failure, I have to be aware of how to treat heart failure properly, or at least bridge a patient until they see a cardiologist. And I'm not going to go and read New England Journal of Medicine cardiology or like urology or what, like all the other subsections. But when I ask a question related to my patient, they will go and surface this answer to me. I'm not going to go deeply into the Google and New York Times relationship. I think this requires like an episode on its own, but it had pros and cons. But Google benefited a lot because Google was the medium that surfaced the answers. And of course, the money was, or lots of money was made by Google through AdSense. This is their business model. And OpenEvidence is doing the same thing. OpenEvidence is trying to become the Google of medical knowledge. That being said, also, I just want to reiterate that I don't have any financial interest or conflict of interest to disclose here. There are other players in the market who also established partnerships with other medical journals. So this is not something unique we see in OpenEvidence. I don't want to oversell OpenEvidence, but they were really good players in knocking down those partnerships and getting the trust of these journals, which is not something easy to do.
I also think it's interesting, how the parallels that we're seeing between partnerships that OpenEvidence made with the New England Journal of Medicine, the partnership that Google made with New York Times, as you mentioned, and then there's also the partnership that Doximity made early on with the US News and World Report. And that partnership was incredibly critical because, US News and World Report was the authority in hospital rankings and health journalism at the time. And so similarly for OpenEvidence, right, this partnership with the New England Journal of Medicine really helps open up the doors and opens up the possibilities for what can be accomplished. And it speaks to the value that partnerships can have, not just in healthcare, but in any business, really, in terms of kind of opening up more avenues for revenue generation opportunities, as well as just building your company's brand name out there in a kind of more prominent way as well.
Now, I think a big question will rise is how do you, and this is as we go deeper, this is like stage one in the funding history. We didn't go deeply into the funding history yet, and we will talk about what's surfacing right now and what people say about the valuation of this company. So at this point, at Series A, how did they value a free product for physicians at $1 billion? I think that's where venture capital gets philosophical, because they are not valuing the company. They are valuing the technology and what the technology could become. There are some revenue potentials. Right now, the main revenue potential of OpenEvidence is through AdSense. And if you go and watch their podcast meeting they had, Zachary Ziegler and Daniel, so their main income is through AdSense. Pharma companies would love to show targeted advertisements to physicians. This is one of the biggest business models ever. And there are so many ways pharma companies want or to usually do this. So pharma companies, they have an army of pharma reps who go and educate physicians about new clinical trials and drugs. Because as you see, is the main dispenser of the drug, is the main barrier of giving a drug, or I wouldn't say the main barrier, the main medium of giving a drug to a patient. And you want that person to be well educated, well informed about the recent, the best, and the newest clinical trials to give the right treatments to the patient, or to consider other treatments when a patient progresses or if they have contraindications. So pharma companies spend billions of dollars on marketing directly to physicians, because physicians are the one who distribute their drugs. And this is something that pharma company wants, is physicians' attention. What OpenEvidence can gain by surfacing answers to the user is their attention. And let's say if you ask a question related to a clinical trial or a drug and you get the answer, OpenEvidence right now shows you a clinical trial advertisement or a new drug advertisement related or might not be related to your question, but it is related to your specialty because OpenEvidence know who you are as a physician, if you are an oncologist, if you are a cardiologist, or something else. So this is one of their income pathways, but there are other things. For example, health system licensing. Every health system acts differently. They have their own protocols. They have their own ways of treating a specific condition. For example, an infectious disease might get treated differently in hospital A, who's on the East Coast, versus hospital B on the West Coast, or a community setting versus academic setting, or in the middle of downtown versus a rural area. Because these bugs, depending on your hospital and depending on all their data, have different sensitivities. So each hospital have their own unique protocols of approaching and treating things. And having an AI to help you find the right protocol of treating a specific condition in your hospital and knowing everything about your hospital protocols would be very valuable. So I see that also one way of licensing their technology. And then also we have the data flywheel that they might have. Every query from a physician is a signal, but I don't think that they will use this. My understanding is OpenEvidence right now is not or will not monetize users' data. I might be wrong. I didn't go into the details, but that's my understanding. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free to reach out to us on email and correct us if that's not the case. But the valuation wasn't really about like any specific revenue model. It was about like this technology and where it can go.
Okay. So going back to February 2025, OpenEvidence is now $1 billion company. Sequoia led the round. The New England Journal of Medicine partnership's been announced. Big things happening for this company, and bigger things are still to come. 5 months later, in July of 2025, another press release comes out. $210 million raised at a $3.5 billion valuation. Suddenly, within 5 months, this company saw 3.5 times or 3.5x increase in valuation. And I think it's important to put that in context here, right? Most companies, they take years to go from Series A to Series B. They spend that time proving out the business model, using the money they raise to scale the team, build revenue. OpenEvidence did all of that in 150 days. And the investor list for OpenEvidence at this time read like the A-list of Silicon Valley in healthcare investing. Google Ventures stepped in here, and Kleiner Perkins stepped in to co-lead the round. Sequoia followed on, and a whole bunch of other VCs that were top tier also piled in. So now they're at a total raise of just over $300 million. And a partner at Google Ventures, Sangin Zeb, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, described the OpenEvidence deal as the most competitive deal in recent memory. It's important to think about what that means. Google Ventures sees thousands of companies every single year, and I touched on it earlier in the episode about how difficult it is to get Google Ventures to care about you. This is the company that invested in Uber, Slack, Stripe, and a partner there is saying that the fight for all was the most intense he's ever experienced. And at this point, every major VC in healthcare, and honestly, just every major VC in general, even if healthcare isn't a part of their thesis, wanted to be in on this round. Why, you ask? Because the metrics that this company was putting out were essentially unheard of. And I want to touch on this. I want to touch on Google's involvement because Google's strategic interest here is fascinating. Our listeners might or might not know, Google has been trying to crack healthcare for decades. Google Health launched, it shut down, they relaunched it again, it struggled. And keep in mind, Google has the world's best AI researchers, more compute power than anyone, and by and large, you can say they have infinite resources, but they still could never figure out how to become this trusted platform for physicians. And now all of a sudden, here's the startup founded by a guy who used to write poetry and study philosophy, capturing the exact market that Google's been chasing for a long, long time. More than 40% of US doctors are on it, and it is basically the most engaged and highest usage cohort in all of professional healthcare software in the AI world at this time. For Google Ventures, this wasn't just a financial investment, right? This was basically Google's opportunity. It was the hole they could crawl through to get an entry into physician AI. And they realized, hey, if we can't build it, maybe we can just own a piece of the company that did. And another top tier VC that co-led along with Google was Kleiner Perkins. And that just adds a whole nother level of credibility, right? Kleiner Perkins is legendary in the world of health technology and healthcare investing. They backed Genentech, which was one of the most important biotechnology companies to ever exist, essentially. And now having both of these top tier VCs on the cap table was basically a signal to the entire healthcare industry that, look, we are real, we are here to stay, and we're coming for you.
Google always, and it's not only Google, Amazon, Walmart, all these big players, they want a chunk of this 20% GDP market, healthcare, but they go to healthcare and then they see how complex it is, how heavy the regulations are, and they like say, screw this, I'm not going to do this. They want a Trojan horse. They really want a good Trojan horse. They want a technology that works, and they want to get into healthcare. And I think OpenEvidence was one of their pathways to get into healthcare. Of course, they have lots of ventures in healthcare, but I think OpenEvidence it could be one of their biggest and the fastest growing. But the story doesn't stop here. They keep going, and we're not done yet. Now it's their Series C. In October 2025, they raised around $200 million, and this also was backed by a Google venture arm as lead with Sequoia, Kleiner Perkins, Blackstone, Thrive, and you name it. Or this financing round valued OpenEvidence at about $6 to $6.1 billion. And at this point, the funding rounds are coming so fast that it's so hard to keep track. OpenEvidence had now raised over $500 million in a less than a year. This is unbelievable. The company that had zero revenue in its Series A, and remember, Sequoia threw like 70 million, now it's being valued 6 times what Doximity, which is a public company with $620 million in annual revenue, was worth in the market cap. The investor list kept getting more impressive, more tier funding raised, but I just want to, also we're going to talk about this, we're going to discuss things. I'm not an expert in valuation. Remember, the big numbers don't always reflect that this is going to work. I'm sure OpenEvidence is a great tool. Like, again, I'm a user of their product and Doximity's products and other products as well. But like, for example, we have other healthcare companies that also raised millions and millions of dollars and then eventually closed shops. I'm excited to see where this goes because I think there are possibilities that we can't imagine. But what I'm trying to say is raising lots of money is not equal to survival. There are so many other healthcare companies that raised hundreds of millions and billions, and then they eventually closed doors and went bankrupt, right? The craziest part of the story is we don't stop here. We continue. January 21st, 2026. Literally, right now we're recording on January 30. A week ago, OpenEvidence drops another bombshell. They raised another $250 million. Now the valuation is $12 billion with a B, led by Thrive Capital, the same firm that backed Cursor and OpenAI. This made OpenEvidence right now the most valuable healthcare AI company based on valuation numbers in the world. Total funding raised so far, now approaching $700 million across 4 rounds in just 12 months. In 12 months, they raised $700 million. Let's put these numbers into perspective. Remember, February 2025, Series A, $1 billion. Sequoia Capital, they put $70 million. July 2025, $3.5 billion Series B. So 3.5x in 5 months. October 2025, they raised $200 million at $6 billion valuation. This is 1.7x in 3 months. January 2026, $12 billion valuation. This is Series D, 2x in 3 months. If you are Sequoia and you led Series A, your $75 million investment, now it's worth $900 million in 11 months. This is unbelievable.
I think it's absolutely staggering with just how much velocity this company grew, as well as the way that they were able to effectively, in a lot of ways, just double their valuation every 3 to 4 months, which is virtually unheard of. And, I know to our listeners, we've thrown a lot of numbers at you in the last little bit. And also to say that the numbers Rupin just mentioned, right? Those are all their valuations at their different funding rounds. But to really kind of encapsulate this, OpenEvidence had zero revenue at its Series A. It makes me think as well, right? Just how sustainable might this really be in the long run? As long as OpenEvidence remains remains tied to servicing physicians and physicians only, it makes me think, right? Like, how long can they possibly sustain this level of growth long term? And might this be a situation, as Rupin referenced a little bit ago, healthcare companies in the past have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Yeah, they've reached multi-billion-dollar valuations, and then they've had to shut down their doors because they just could not sustain their growth. And it brings me back to kind of the advice that is always given to startup founders, which is don't raise too much money, because once you raise a certain amount of money and a certain valuation is now tied to you, you now have to live up to that valuation. And I think it'll be interesting to see over the next 12 to 18 months, can OpenEvidence live up to this $12 billion valuation?
To our listeners, I want to quote from the Health Tech Nerds newsletter. For those who don't know, the Health Tech Nerds newsletter is a great newsletter that covers the news of healthcare, including technology, finance. You can go and sign up, and you can also join their Slack community. And they talk about the valuation of OpenEvidence. In their newsletter, they say that OpenEvidence rapid increase, it is similar actually to a famous valuation debate between Aswat Damodaran and Bill Gurley a decade ago. So if you don't know who is Damodaran, he's a finance professor, I think. He's very famous on YouTube. He wrote lots of books, and he also has lots of lessons on company valuation and how you value a company. Bill Gurley, he was one of the early investors in Uber. If you haven't watched the TV series about Uber, I think you should go and watch the TV series about Uber, so you know better who Bill Gurley is. What was the name of the TV series again, Sam?
It was called Super Pump, and
yes.
It was based off of a great book as well.
Exactly. So Damodaran and Gurley, they went back and forth on Uber valuation after they raised a funding at $18 billion in June 2014. Damodaran argued that Uber was significantly overvalued based on his analysis, suggesting that the $6 billion was more appropriate. Gurley was also on the board of Uber, argued that Damodaran missed the point. Uber was significantly undervalued in ways that wouldn't show up in the discount cash flow analysis, as its offering allowed it to fundamentally redefine the market. It was really interesting debate between those two great minds. And again, I'm quoting all this from the Health Tech Nerds. If we look at OpenEvidence, I don't know. And again, let us know in the comments if you think this valuation is fair or not. Right now, the main users are physicians. The acquisition could come from other companies like Google or OpenAI, or other big, huge players that can buy this company to pay back the investors. If we're going to think about this valuation, also you have to think about what this technology can do, and not only how much money they are making right now. and how much money they can make in the future. Now I want to offer listeners another way to think about this valuation. Because so far we've been comparing OpenEvidence to Doximity. And if you look at OpenEvidence through that lens, $12 billion and $100 million in ad revenue looks aggressive. But what if we are using the wrong lens? There is a fascinating conversation on the Lex Fridman podcast, episode 490, The State of AI in 2026, where Sebastian Rashka, one of the most respected ML researchers and educators in the world, makes the point of the future of AI. And he says, the general purpose LLMs like ChatGPT and the Claude are not even scratching the surface of what an LLM can do if it is really specifically trained and designed for a specific task. Industries like pharmaceutical, law, and finance will hire people from frontier labs to build in-house models on their proprietary data, and that will be massive unlock. And that reframes everything about OpenEvidence. They have hundreds of millions of real physician queries capturing how doctors actually think through complex cases. And this proprietary training data that no one else on the planet can get. And here's where it gets really interesting. Who needs a specialized medical AI models? Pharma companies. They have tons of clinical trial data, and they need an AI to help them synthesize this data and have better understanding of their clinical trials and how they can improve them, how they can cut the cost, how they can predict better which drug is going to have better outcomes, and all these things. So it's not just PubMed abstract. It's not just answering physician questions. If we look at OpenEvidence as an AI company, that might justify the valuation. And since they have like a niche talent in generating or creating a medical trained LLMs, that could change the way. And right now, maybe OpenEvidence is using the clinical decision support just as a way of accessing the market and telling people, hey, we have really good LLMs. But then they are doing that already, partnering up with pharma, partnering up with other companies to create or generate or build a specialized LLMs that runs in-house for specific customer. And they go more enterprise. And that's where the money is. So if we don't look at it as a marketing company, if we look at it as an AI company, that might justify the valuation. Because remember, these VCs, when they are investing a $12 billion valuation, they are expecting at least to 10x their monies, if not more. So at $12 billion valuation, they're expecting this company will be valued at $100 billion or $200 billion to make their 10 times their money back or 20 times their money back. That's where things become really interesting. I don't know what the future plans are for OpenEvidence, but that's another way of looking at it.
Given the long-term plans that they have for the company as well, and at the time of recording this, they did 17.9 million clinical consultations in December 2025, which was a 7x growth compared to a year previous in December 2024. And about 45% of all doctors in the United States now use OpenEvidence. And based off of the advertising $1 million in annual recurring revenue. And Daniel Nadler has come out and said that, we can do $1 billion in revenue if we sold all of our available ad slots. But at the moment, they seem to be in a bit of a holding pattern where they're holding back to try and protect the user experience. And if that sounds familiar to anybody, that's because that's exactly what Google did back in the early 2000s. But I want to talk about Daniel a little bit more. The most recent records that are available based off of the Forbes rankings has his net worth as around $7.6 billion. And that's more than double the $3.6 billion valuation from just 3 months earlier. And at present, he owns 58% of the company. And Zachary Ziegler, the CTO and co-founder, holds about 7.3%. So to me, it's incredibly interesting how somebody with a philosophy PhD who, wrote poetry and is really passionate about the arts is effectively now one of the wealthiest healthcare entrepreneurs on the planet at just 42 years old. And it doesn't look like Zachary and Daniel don't seem like they're planning on stopping anytime soon. One of the most interesting things to come out of their Series D announcement was an updated vision the company announced, where they said that they're building towards medical superintelligence. And for those of our listeners that don't really understand or know what that means, Here's really how it works, right? Instead of having one giant AI model, there is a central conductor, analyzes the question, and then routes it to the most relevant specialist model. And it's really like having a hospital full of world-class experts available instantly 24/7. And Nadler puts it as, if you think about it, it really works exactly like a human hospital, but it just lives on a massive server farm somewhere. And in my opinion, right, this is really what the next phase of medical and healthcare AI looks like, right? Not just answering questions from doctors, but actually approaching problems with a level of reasoning that either matches or exceeds the best human specialists. And all this to say, and Rupin, you may have your own opinion on this, but all this to say that my personal belief is that AI should never replace the physician. It should never replace the clinician in practice, but it should be something that augments them and supports them in their ability to provide care to patients. I think healthcare should always operate under a human-based model. And moving forward, I think if you pair these smaller specialized AI models with the doctors practicing in these specialties, you can really create a super team of doctors that are able to operate on a level that maybe they might not have been able to previously.
I completely agree with you. I think we will end up in 10 years into a hybrid model. There will be things where patients will have access to, especially in underserved areas. For example, like a doctor might diagnose you with high blood pressure but you can titrate medications up and down with an AI. So we'll have a hybrid model. Or you might get a plan through an AI, it gets signed by a doctor. So here the doctor just makes sure that things are going well and the AI is not making any mistakes. You need that human supervision. There are other specialties where you still need doctor-patient interaction, for example, like palliative care, helping cancer patients with their symptoms. Oncology, radiation oncology, you want to see the doctor as a patient. I don't see AI completely replacing physicians. I see a medium where AI doing some jobs that they don't require a doctor all the time. They are algorithmic. And there will be a place where AI augments physicians, especially in areas where it's not slam dunk. There is no one right answer. You need two humans to discuss what is the best treatment approach going forward based on their desires and what they value in life. That's the other thing I see. Also, we have to take into consideration other historical events. We are witnessing a behavioral change of patients, and this is similar to Airbnb days. I use this example all the time. When Airbnb they pitched to investors, their idea was we will help people rent a room in their house to a stranger and get paid. If you were an investor at that time and you will hear this, you will think like this is out of the norm. Who would trust a stranger in their house? But this happened. Now, as we know, Airbnb, it's a huge company, right? At this point, I wonder as a physician, are we going to see this change in a human behavior where patients want to completely deal with AI and that's it? They don't want to see a human because it's faster, it's cheaper, it's available 24/7, or they still want to see a human and because they trust a human, they want to have a discussion with another entity that is based from flesh and the soul.
If you go to an investor and you say, hey, we want to build an entire platform off of renting out a mattress in our living room, the investor's going to look at you like you're a little bit crazy. The key thing that Airbnb was able to leverage on was that there was a gap between what the current perception is versus what the reality is, right? The investor might perceive that, hey, that's kind of crazy, right? Just renting out a room in a stranger's house to stay in seems a little crazy. But the reality was that strangers and individuals were more than okay with it. They were more than glad to be able to get access to, living or staying in the downtown core of a major city and having to pay half of what they would have normally paid for a hotel room. And I think similarly, we might see a same sort of approach when it comes to open evidence around There might be this perception that AI cannot play or AI should not play such a critical role in patient care. But the reality, and we're seeing this with the launch of OpenAI for healthcare and Claude for healthcare, is that the reality is 230 million people are using AI for the purposes of augmenting their healthcare at the end of the day. And the gap on a large level may be because there's that perception again that why would you ask an AI that's really just an automated way of predicting the next possible word in a sentence to help you with something as critical as your medicine? The reality that we're seeing is that patients and physicians are able to extract real value from it and are willing to use it and adopt it on a regular basis.
I want us to zoom out. We've been talking about OpenEvidence and it's an engine to help physicians, but over the last 12 months, they built several tools. First, released an AI Scribe tool, a dialer, and also they released DeepConsult. What is dialer? Let's talk about the phone call problem so you can understand what dialer is. Let's imagine it's 2024. We have a physician. Let's call her Sarah. She works as a hospitalist in Chicago, and she is standing in the hospital's parking lot at 7 p.m. She's exhausted. She had like 12-hour shift. Her phone rings, and patient calling back about their discharge instructions. Sarah answers. The patient is confused, asks a question. Sarah explains, and the call takes around 15 minutes. That's totally fine. That's part of her job, but that's a problem. The patient now has Sarah's personal cell phone number. The next day, the patient calls again at 10 p.m., then at 6 a.m., then next day morning, then their family member starts calling Sarah. Then they give the number to another patient Sarah saw last month. Within 2 weeks, Sarah is getting 30 to 40 calls a week on her personal phone, nights, weekends, during dinner, and this is after working 12-hour shifts in the hospital, and she can't turn it off because like some of those calls are generally urgent. If one of your patients is calling you and you're in need, you can't just turn it off and say, I'm having dinner with my family. So depending on the situation, there might be some legal consequences. This is the hidden tax of being a doctor in 2025 and 2026. And even, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years with technology, the ability to reach to other doctors is like so easy. Your personal phone call becomes your work phone. Giving your own personal phone number, it's not a solution to patients, and we always need another way. So in December 4, 2025, OpenEvidence announced something that has nothing to do with AI or medical literature. They launched a product called the Dialer. And here's how it works. Sarah opens the OpenEvidence app on her iPhone, and she taps the dialer. She enters the patient's number. And when she calls the patient, the caller ID shows the hospital's main number, not Sarah's hospital phone call, or whatever number Sarah wants to assign, depending on OpenEvidence policy, what they allow physician to choose number. And this way, Sarah protected herself. And then what the patients see, they see that this is Dr. X, Y, and Z from XYZ hospital calling you. And also from the patient's end, they are not like seeing an unknown number, which they think it's a spam. It's a help in both directions. And we talked about this also when we covered doximity in our previous episodes. So for our listeners who are interested, you can go and listen to our episode about doximity. And now when you bundle the AI with the dialer for free, become habit-forming tools. And that is one product in addition to their AI search engine that they offered to doctors. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in August 2025, they released an AI Scribe. And the AI Scribe, it's a technology where it listens to a patient-physician encounter and creates a note. But what makes OpenEvidence AI Scribe a bit unique is that the search engine is already embedded within the AI Scribe. That means, as a physician, when you have an encounter with the patient and you finish your encounter, and the AI Scribe generates the notes, you can also chat with OpenEvidence's clinical decision support tool to ask questions about this encounter specifically. So now the clinical decision support tool has access to the context of the encounter. You just don't go and ask, what is the treatment of this cancer? You ask a question like, what am I missing about this patient? What other options do I have? Is my management up to date? Is there anything else I can do? can you find me references that back up my plan? Now they are combining two things in one product. And as we mentioned in our previous episode, AI Scribe on its own, it's not a company anymore. AI Scribe, it's a feature. It's something that you offer in addition to other things. Companies might offer other services like AI Receptionist in addition to AI Scribe. And some companies like AvoMD, for example, they offer multiple AI tools for community-based clinics. As you see now, OpenEvidence is adding complementary tools to their own technology and to improve the technology and to increase physicians' productivity.
And I just want to highlight here, because I'm a product guy, I come from a product development and design background, in addition to the work that I've done in privacy. And, I just want to hone in on what's actually happening here, because OpenEvidence started as a medical search engine. Doctors asked questions and they got evidence-based answers. On its own, that's a great product. But the problem with search is that it's episodic, and you only use it when you have a question and then you leave. And Daniel Nadler and Zachary Ziegler understood that to become indispensable in this space, you have to move away from episodic to continuous usage. And that's why they built visits for every patient encounter. They have their ambient scribe running in the background. And when you need to contact patients or patients need to contact you, you have Dialer. And if you want to keep up with your medical education and you want to be informed about the most recent things that are coming out, you have the Discover feature that they created. So the medical search engine on its own, a great product, but in a lot of ways, it served as a Trojan horse. Doctors came for the answers, but they stayed because OpenEvidence became the place where they could conduct and handle and manage phone calls. They could have an AI scribe running and their continuing medical education requirements. And so really it became a platform that went from really being kind of episodic, use it when you need it, to something that became really a critical, almost infrastructure layer for clinical workflows and clinical practice in general. So to put it all together, really, what OpenEvidence built was their free medical search with cited evidence that solved the I need an answer fast problem, right? It gets doctors in the door. They went down the product psychology roadmap where they tried to make this into a habit-forming product where you now have visits for documentation, you have Dialer for calls, Discover for updates, which the usage of the application from being episodic to now continuous. Because you're solving a daily workflow problem, you now have doctors using it 10, 20 times a day, if not more.
There are a couple of products that OpenEvidence has released. They don't get lots of media's attention. In April 2025, they launched free CME credits, very similar to what we talked about in our previous episodes, that physicians, they need to be up to date and they on their education. And you as a physician, you have to let regulatory bodies, for example, the American Medical Association or other bodies, know that you as a physician, you are still continuing your medical education. And these are called CME credits. If right now you are already using OpenEvidence to answer clinical questions throughout your day, at the end of the week, the app say, hey, you want to turn those questions into a CME credit or continuing medical education credit. You review your research, you take a short assessment, and boom, you have AMA PRA Category 1 credit. And that means the American Medical Association now agree that you as a physician are continuing your medical education. And even though you got this education through your search, so every physician now in America can get CME credits. It is requirement, and OpenEvidence help with that. So back to your point, they looped into the physician's habit, and they also launched another product. They released a free USMLE prep tutor. As we talked about the United States medical licensing exam, they released an AI tool that helped to create questions that pulls from gold standards, like in journals that they had partnerships with, like the New England Journal of Medicine or the Journal of American Medical Association. And then they turn this into questions. And now their strategy is they want to be used by medical students early in their career, because you want to build this habit loop early on. You want a physician to use your product during your medical training. They are while they are medical students, and then while they are resident, and then while they are staff. So you keep that stickiness. similar to the stickiness that UpToDate built over the last 20, 30 years or even more.
Yeah, and I think collectively being able to service physicians across multiple parts of their workflows is incredibly critical. And I think the way they went about it is incredibly important too, because if you think about it from the perspective of how sales looks like, if a company goes into a hospital and says, hey, look, right, we can basically replace your entire clinical workflow. Doctors are not only going to be skeptical, most likely they're going to reject that. But if you go in and you ask them the first question of what is one of the biggest problems you're experiencing, and based off of Daniel's experience, it told him that, hey, doctors are drowning in medical literature. So, okay, we can solve that problem, and we solve it with AI-powered search and perfect citations. Then, once you've done that, and once you've proven that it works, then you can go out and you can ask those same doctors, hey, what other problems can we solve for you? Do you have problems with documentation? Here's a scribe. You have problems with privacy during phone calls? Here's a dialer. You're worried about legal compliance? No problem. We've built in HIPAA infrastructure and compliance from day one. And so really, by and large, one feature at a time, OpenEvidence is slowly capturing all of the biggest problems doctors have today and how they manage and how they do their everyday work.
I want to send this message to our listeners. I want to talk about my dream. I have a dream. I want to tell you about it. And that's where I see the market going. Even despite all this, there is still lots of a friction for us as doctors. We open the electronic medical record. We go through, which sucks. Most EMRs suck with respect to the biggest vendors in the country. There are 5,000 ways of doing one thing. You open that, and then you have to extract information from that. And now you have to go and open another window. In my case, I'm an oncologist. I have to go and log in to get information about genetic tests from third-party vendors, like, for example, companies like Caris, Guardant, Tempus, Foundation One, you name it. And then I have to go if I'm using an AI Scribe, I have to go and use my AI Scribe. Then if I have a question, I have to go to OpenEvidence or Doximity or the AI tool that I'm using and ask this question. As you see, there is so much friction. I think the future will be where you have one AI that runs in the background, that runs in the electronic medical record. You don't have to open 5,000 pages on your laptop, on your computer, and tabs. You open the electronic medical record, and then you get only the information that you need. You turn the AI Scribe that is part of your electronic medical record. While you're talking, the AI Scribe is following the context of the conversation and showing you if whatever you're saying is accurate or not, or if there are any research that is newer than your knowledge base and helping you. Or maybe once you're done with the conversation, the AI Scribe starts generating the transcript. It will surface this evidence to you and it will show you, hey, you did well in this, but you might consider maybe this drug instead of this drug because your patient have XYZ in the background, or maybe there is this phase 1 trial that change the way we treat this. So it runs in the background without you going to the AI Scribe, asking one question at a time, another question at a time. The AI, it's not only for finding the right answer, and I always said this, AI is here to augment physicians. As a physician, I might miss some blood work. I might miss some imaging findings. I might miss the newest clinical trial. And I need the AI to run in the background without me typing questions and find my blind spots. That's my dream. That's where this product should go. Right now, we are in the very early stages. And with building a product like this, it's very doable in this day and age with the current technology. It's just like, how do you put these vendors or these products together? Because you have to have either OpenEvidence integrate with EMR, or you have to have an EMR that has native search in it directly, which I don't see any of the big EMR vendors doing it.
Yeah, and I think it opens the doors for kind of multiple visions of what the future may look like. And I absolutely endorse your dream. And I think it's one that if it existed, it would solve so many problems for doctors everywhere. And this is the biggest roadblock for almost every health tech company and every health tech startup out there is working with the complexity, the annoyingness, the difficulty of existing EMR vendors. If you talk to Epic, they basically are by and large overlooking open evidence entirely. And they're saying, yeah, that's all cool and whatnot, but we're just going to come out and create our own AI scribes. We're going to create our own AI-based clinical documentation tools. So it may be a future where open evidence may actually pose a threat to Epic in some ways if they can establish partnerships with the smaller EMRs, right? You have your top two that are, most common in the United States and in the world, Epic and Cerner. But the ones below that, right? The ranks number 3 to 10, right? If open evidence was to explore partnerships with them and say, hey, let us become a partner with you and let us solve all of these problems for you so that you can compete better with the top two, it may really set up a situation where for the first time in decades since Epic was launched and when Cerner consolidated itself, it may be the first time that there might be real competition in the EMR space, and open evidence may be the catalyst for the competition being blown wide open.
Completely. You have really good points there. We talked about how they went directly to the physician and we talked about their products, but I think maybe we should give our listeners an idea of how revolutionary was going direct to consumer or direct to physician was. Do you want to cover and tell our listeners how a sales cycle look like, traditional healthcare sales cycle?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to the sales cycles of hospitals, let's look at the way that it's always been done. And it's been done this way for decades, really since the dawn of healthcare information technology. And there's really only been one way to sell medical software, and that's that you sell it to institutions, not individuals. And the common flow here is, you build your sales team, you hire your enterprise sales reps, and these people have contact lists of individuals at the hospital systems. And these enterprise sales reps, they know how to navigate the multiple layers of bureaucracy that exist in healthcare organizations, and especially when it comes to healthcare procurement. So there's really anywhere from a 6-month to an 18-month sales cycle where you might target a large hospital system, let's say Massachusetts General Brigham in Boston or Kaiser Permanente in California. And you might start with a cold call to the chief information officer. Maybe you get a meeting, then you meet with the IT committee, then you meet with clinical leadership, then you do a pilot with just one department, and then they evaluate. And that evaluation can take anywhere from 6 months to a year, especially if you're touting improved outcomes as a part of your software, and the hospital wants to be able to measure, okay, what was the outcomes before we signed with you? What are the outcomes after? And once they see this data, and if they like what they see, then they need budget approval. And so that's why this can take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, because it might be that you get a pilot, but that pilot doesn't translate into a long-term software deal for another 12 months after you get your pilot. So after you've closed the pilot process and after you've closed the deal, you get maybe $500,000 per year for a 2-year contract. And the hospital system will now roll out your software to their physicians. And you have a team that does training, you integrate with their EHR system, you provide customer support. That alone is a very long process, and startups especially need to have the runway to support that 6 months to 2-year long sales cycle. But even after you've sold into the hospital, one of the biggest problems that startups run into, or health tech companies in general, is that even though the hospital bought your software, that doesn't mean doctors will use it. Doctors are already drowning in software. They have a EHR system that many of them hate, but they're forced to use because it's the only way to have your documentation organized in a way that you can get reimbursed. You have a separate system for the pharmacy workflows. You have a lab system for test orders. And there's dozens of logins, a whole ton of passwords, and a lot of interfaces that just don't talk to each other, right? Interoperability is still by and large a problem in many hospital systems. And now you're the healthcare IT vendor, and what you've really done is you've added another tool to their workflow, right? It's another login, another system to learn. And so unless your software is so valuable that it's worth the cognitive overhead and the increased time it takes to update it and work with it, doctors just won't use it. The hospital might have paid for it, the IT team deployed it, but it sits unused. And this is why there's a graveyard, really, of healthcare technology where billions of dollars have been spent on software that promised to transform medicine, but really it just ended up as another thing on the shelf that goes untouched and unused. This was really the only way anyone knew how to sell medical software until OpenEvidence came around.
And talking about all this long pathway to sell something to a healthcare, let's flip the table upside down. What if we go directly and we sell to physicians? What if we go and give the user the product directly? Because in healthcare, as we said, the user is not your payer and your payer is not your user. But what if we go directly to the user? And that seemed crazy at that time. Now it looks very obvious, but that seemed crazy. I wouldn't say maybe crazy because like Doximity did this in the past. It's not only Doximity, there are other platforms, they went direct to user. But in general, this shift, it wasn't only in one or two companies. This shift has been in lots of companies. They go directly to the physician. So one, they pass regulatory hurdles, but they don't pass liability. That's our opinion. We might be wrong because like when it comes to PHIs, as we mentioned, there might be liability. And what Nadler believed, I think it works, is doctors use these apps. They have iPhones, they have Androids, they use Google Maps, they use WhatsApp, they use other professional apps on their phone. Why they won't use OpenEvidence and why they want to go through all this long sell cycle. And that's what they actually did. First, there was a verification gate. They wanted to create exclusivity. They wanted to make sure that only doctors access to their platform. And they did this through making sure when you're going to sign up, you have to have what we call National Provider Identifier Number, which is a unique ID issued to licensed physicians in the United States by the federal government. If you don't have that number, you don't have an access. So they made sure that only physicians with this number can access the platform. And they wanted to have some quality control. Physicians ask better questions than general public, and they use medical terminology correctly, and they understand what they are reading. So they gave the user or the physician here a content that is heavy on medical terms. If you go to ChatGPT and ask a medical question, even if you are a physician, the answer is going to be usually directed to the general average person, like not the physician. But here, OpenEvidence made sure that the quality of the content and the type of answer generated is exclusive for the physician. And they avoided this Dr. Google problem. As a physician, I wouldn't say we hate, but it's sometimes a bit challenging when patients come with self-diagnosing conditions that don't fit the clinical picture, because on text, a patient might have XYZ problems, but in reality, no way this problem will fit their clinical picture in life. And this something comes from experience. So they avoided patients direct access to OpenEvidence, which I feel like they might have benefited if they created an OpenEvidence version direct to patient, because let's be honest, if they don't do it, someone else is going to do it. And now OpenAI and Claude, they are all going direct to consumer.
I think I would kind of disagree with that assessment in a lot of ways, right? Because if I'm a patient and I'm not a physician, and if I was given access to OpenEvidence, I would be asking it questions all day long. And I think especially in their early stages, as they wanted to control their compute costs and control, the level of input tokens and output tokens that were being used on the platform, by going direct to physicians, it kind of help them have a more predictable run rate and predictable burn rate as well. But beyond that, think about the impact that WebMD had on physicians, right? Every physician I've ever talked to absolutely hates WebMD. And now imagine a patient is coming in having talked to OpenEvidence, and OpenEvidence is giving them all this medical jargon, and now they're just reiterating that back to their physician. The physician is now in a tough spot, right? Where they're now having to basically debate the patient about what OpenEvidence has said, as well as also now prescribe their own treatment plan. And it would have created more bottlenecks. I think by keeping the information clinically reviewed as well, because as a patient, if OpenEvidence is going to tell me something, I'm going to believe it. I'm going to listen to it. I'm going to be like, yes, they know what they're talking about. But if a physician uses OpenEvidence and OpenEvidence maybe says something that's not entirely accurate for any reason, the physician is in a much better position to catch that. And so from OpenEvidence's perspective on a liability side, they don't ever want to be in a situation where now they have to, deal with a patient asking OpenEvidence a question and now they're getting an improper response back. The patient acts on it and now the patient's in the ER, OpenEvidence is getting sued. So I think I agree with you long term. Maybe OpenEvidence creates a product to compete with OpenAI and Claude, but maybe giving access to patients to OpenEvidence in its current form might not be the best idea.
My pushback to that, and your points are very well taken, and I really love talking to you about those points because you bring different view than I do. And my pushback to that point is, as an oncologist, lots of patients come to me and they went online, searched X or Reddit, and they got information about albendazole or mebendazole or ivermectin, which I know I'm going to get huge lashback, but these drugs don't work for cancer. For the love of God, for the believers in the conspiracy theory, these drugs don't work. And I would have loved if there is a trustable tool that go and get content from PubMed and well-researched, peer-reviewed, and answer patients. Because in this day and age, patients go into these medical influencers who lack any degrees, and they go and listen to them, and then they come and tell me, oh, I want to take ivermectin. That ivermectin messes with their liver, and now if they are on immunotherapy, for example, which is a drug can affect the liver, and they have elevated liver enzymes, come and figure out, is it the immunotherapy, the drug that is well studied through peer review process, or is it the ivermectin that I know that doesn't work for their cancer? And that's put me into dilemma. Having an educated patient, I know we talk a lot about liability, but also we have to empower patients. We have to give them the right tools, because if they didn't do it, someone else is going to do it. And you have to empower patients with reliable tool to get medical information. This is the age of information democracy.
I agree with you actually now hearing what you have to say, and it reminds me of some of my own personal experiences of patients doing self-research. I've been a caregiver to loved ones with cancer for almost 5 years now, and luckily the people that I was being a caregiver for never had issues around what you're describing, but back when they were first diagnosed, I joined a Facebook group about cancer patients and caregivers. And some of the things I was seeing, it was scary, right? You had people commenting like, stop all chemotherapy, stop all treatments, start using this Chinese herbal medicine, start using peppermint oil and all of these different things to treat your cancer and you'll be okay. The chemotherapy is going to kill you. Go down this route. And I was so angry seeing that because I was like, the people that are giving this advice in the comments are not medical professionals in any way whatsoever. And you're really impacting somebody's life at the end of the day by giving this kind of improper or inaccurate advice. So I think hearing your counterpoint, I agree with you a little bit. I think having a patient-facing tool like OpenEvidence could actually really contribute to patient education, as you mentioned.
Because every time a patient comes to me and tells me about this drug, I have to convince them. Now I have to educate my patient on how, as physicians, as a scientific community, came up with the conclusion that this XYZ, the drug, work. I have to go and tell them how the peer process work, how we write a paper, how it gets vetted by journals and peer reviewers, how billions of dollars are spent on developing a drug, if ivermectin, and I know I'm talking about a lot of ivermectin, but literally it's one of the common drugs that I hear about. If ivermectin worked, the company that is developing ivermectin would spend billions of dollars on the drug to prove that it works and bring it to you in the right way. But if the company who is going to make tons of money is not doing that, how on earth do you believe that it works?
I agree with you 100%. I think having a patient education tool, especially for people with chronic illnesses and chronic diseases, could potentially go a long way. Because, like you mentioned, right, you spend a lot of time yourself educating the patient, and that time that you spend, yes, it's very, very valuable. But if the patient came in already educated, you could spend more time with that patient on actually managing their care and improving their treatment and even just listening to them in a lot of ways rather than having to educate them about the peer review process and the importance of making sure that any medication they take has gone through FDA clearances and is actually prescribed for the usage of treating their cancer or something like that. So I agree with you. I think there's definitely an opportunity here, and maybe OpenEvidence will capitalize on it, of having a patient-facing side of their application that doesn't do the medical jargon side. And that's where I think OpenAI and Claude are really hoping to step in and say that we can provide patient education so that the physicians can spend their time actually working with a patient that understands the disease they have. So now I think let's take a step back and analyze what just happened, right? Because OpenEvidence really broke every rule of the healthcare sales cycle that we talked about earlier, where no enterprise sales team, no super long sales cycles, no contracts with hospitals. Now they're in a process where they are actually developing enterprise partnerships. But way back when they started, they didn't have any hospital contracts, and they were shipping the software for free at the time. Despite breaking every rule of healthcare sales, they still achieved 40% of US physicians were using the platform, and they had faster adoption than really any medical technology in history. You might be thinking like, hey, this is a really novel approach that they took, but not necessarily, right? Doximity had taken a very similar strategy in the sense that they said, look, let's go to clinicians first. But the one thing I want to highlight here is that the stakes at which OpenEvidence was operating at versus Doximity was operating at were very different, in the sense that Doximity started out as really becoming a social platform where doctors can engage with one another, share information, and build connections with one another. And OpenEvidence went straight into really being a clinical decision support tool. And that's where the requirements for accuracy, the requirements for meeting physicians where they're at, were a lot different than the direction Doximity took. So I think OpenEvidence was really a pioneer in the space of creating a clinical decision support tool that went directly to clinicians as opposed to exploring the enterprise sales cycle in healthcare.
Yeah, I completely agree with that point. Now, the biggest question is how OpenEvidence make money? This is very important. We talked about their valuation. Right now, their current valuation is $12 billion, and they've raised so far $700 million. And this is what makes every MBA student's brain circuit stop. Like, OpenEvidence doesn't charge a single dollar for their service. It's not like ChatGPT. They are selling APIs and they have monthly subscriptions. There is no monthly subscription fee. There is no usage limit, unlike Anthropic. But there are ads. So natural question, and everyone is asking, like, how do they make money? One of the ways they are making money right now is through advertisements, but also there are other ways we were going to analyze. And we have to take a look at other companies who are in similar space, I would say, or similar business model, which is catching the attention of a specific population. If you look at Facebook was free for users from 2004 until 2007. They didn't have a revenue model. They focused only on growth. 800 million users before anyone really understood how would they monetize. Then, targeted advertising to businesses. $117 billion in revenue in 2023. Let's talk about LinkedIn. Free for professionals. Build the network first. Figure out monetization later. Today, recruiters pay. Job seekers pay for premium. Advertisers pay. $15 billion in annual revenue. Let's look at Google. Free search, free email, free everything. Build ubiquity first, then sell ad to businesses who want to access those users. $307 billion in revenue in 2023. The pattern is clear. Capture a dominant position in a valuable professional or a consumer vertical and monetize it and become inevitable. And here is the key insight that Sequoia and Google Ventures understand. OpenEvidence isn't just capturing a market. They are becoming an infrastructure of medicine. When 40% of the physicians are making clinical decisions on your platform and you're heading to like 50%, 60%, depending on the competition and what other clinical decision support tools capture, your utility, your phone system, your power grid becomes the infrastructure of the healthcare system. Let's talk about 4 revenue streams, which they are not talking about, but one they mentioned in their previous episode. Let's talk about possible revenue streams. Let's get this right, okay? They did not mention this. They did not talk about this. This is our analysis and our assumption of how they make money. One way of them making money is through advertisements. And this is the old way of making money. You capture the attention of a specific population and then you advertise. But I think there is beyond that. The other way of making money is institutional licensing, the enterprise play. At one point, OpenEvidence had an API, but now they don't have an API. You can't just go and get an API and use their models the same way you do for OpenAI or Anthropic. And honestly, I think they might go to offer an API. Because think about it, like integration with electronic medical records like Epic and Cerner, HIPAA compliance, clinical decision support, and any other platform that healthcare workers use. They also give you usage analytics for your own institution. They can create admin dashboards for a specific clinical institution to track clinical decision patterns and if the clinical decision is being made according to the guidelines or not. They can have an API that you can do an AI call and look at the physician's decisions on day-to-day basis. Are these up to date according to the most recent guidelines or not? If you're a hospital sitting on a huge data and this data is mainly physician's note, you can run OpenEvidence AI in the background, scan the notes and make sure that all these notes are up to date. Or if there are things that needs to be improved and notify these physicians, you can run the clinical decision support in the background and then tell physicians about things that they can improve. And they have also like physicians can have like a coaching from AI that making sure that their recommendations are up to date. So I think that's a big play, but I haven't seen OpenAI use it yet. The institutional licensing and having an API, integrating this API into different things, different AMRs or platforms in the hospital, I think it's a big game and they might be heading there. Actually, it's worth mentioning that in October 2025, the same month they were raising Series C, OpenEvidence announced a collaboration with Microsoft to integrate OpenEvidence's technology into Dragon Copilot, which is Microsoft's AI clinical assistant. And remember, Microsoft at one point bought Nuance. Nuance is the company that created Dragon Dictation. Dragon Copilot, it's a dictation. It was actually a dictation tool that was one of the standards that's been used across Canada and the US. But now they also have Dragon Copilot, which is an AI scribe that listens to doctor-patient conversation. So OpenEvidence, now they have a partnership with Microsoft, and this real-time access to peer-reviewed medical literature back directly into a real-time dictation or like having an AI scribe might help both companies.
I think I disagree a little bit with your take on OpenEvidence making an API. The moment you release an API, you lose the visibility of OpenEvidence as a company.
Well, how you can lose on giving access to your models through API? If you think about it, like I'm happy to hear your thoughts is, and again, you don't have to give it to any startup. You can still choose your customers. If Epic or Cerner or other big players, they want to use your API, then you can choose your customers.
Partnerships with Epic and Microsoft and other large-scale companies, they can make a lot of strategic sense, but I think Unlike OpenAI, where OpenAI recognizes, hey, we can't build everything, so let's create an API so we can generate revenue for. OpenEvidence, I think, is still in a position where they're still going to want to be continuing to develop new products, and they can make a lot more money owning the product as opposed to just opening the API because they have such mass adoption now with, not mass, but they have 40% of US doctors. And so because of that, they would rather create the products themselves than let other people create the product on top of their technology because they're operating in this niche medical industry, whereas OpenAI is effectively open to everyone.
The other pathway also of making money is pharma partnership. And here is where it gets really interesting. In October 2025, the same month as the Series C announcement, OpenEvidence, they released that they are partnering with Viva Systems. Viva is a publicly traded company. The ticker of Viva is VEEV, that builds cloud software for life sciences companies. They are the backbone of clinical trials and drug development. Now, the partnership, it's a joint platform where they will use AI to increase patients' access to clinical trials and accelerate the drug discovery through better understanding of unmet needs. And they want to improve the understanding and the adoption of existing approved medicine. That's what they release in their blog post. First, let's talk what is a clinical trial. Clinical trial is how we discover new drugs. If I have a new experimental drug, I run a study where I have a group of patients take the standard of care, what we use now, and another group of patients take the experimental drug. But I know from previous studies on animals and a smaller number of patients that this drug should work better than what the standard of care is. Recruiting patients to clinical trials, it's a topic on its own that requires 2 episodes of podcasts, and there are tons of companies who are doing this. But OpenEvidence also is doing this. Right now on OpenEvidence, you ask a question, and then if your question is answered by a clinical trial, OpenEvidence might show you as a physician what are the clinical trials that are running around you or close to you that you can recruit your patients to. And the Viva partnership, that's a signal that they are going that way.
Yeah, I think the Viva partnership is definitely one that kind of enables additional opportunities for them. And the clinical trials space is one that is already huge on its own. And you add an AI layer on top of that, and who knows where it's going. And there's quite a few companies that have popped up in just the last 18 months alone that are seeking to compete in this space. This partnership definitely makes a lot of sense from OpenEvidence's perspective. And VCs get access to information that we just can't get access to because OpenEvidence is a private company to this day. But by kind of reading between the lines a little bit and seeing, okay, how will OpenEvidence make money? In some ways, they already are, right? The Viva partnership is generating revenue, and they're likely, this is a hypothesis, we don't know for sure, it's speculation, but they're probably running quiet pilots with a handful of pharma companies, and they're testing the pricing, refining the product, and all of this is likely covered under mountains of NDAs and things like that, which is why we can't see it. But there's definitely pathways to becoming a multi-billion-dollar annual recurring revenue company. The way that they get there is something that I think Rupin and I will be closely watching over the next year or two to see how they get there. Because as I mentioned earlier too, these massive investments of hundreds of millions of dollars that are being made into OpenEvidence, VCs don't just hand out money for free or because they like doing it, right? They expect returns. They expect that they will be, if they give 100 million, they want $1 billion back. And so accordingly, the way that OpenEvidence will get there will be something that we need to closely watch over the next little bit. Because if they start to not be able to produce the revenue that investors are expecting, we might be in a situation where we see OpenEvidence either getting sold or being broken up into multiple different companies. Obviously, this is just a hypothesis, and it all depends on, can they really hone in on and develop a very reliable business partnership and recurring revenue generation pathway.
Now, we talked about all these things. Let's analyze OpenEvidence as a business. And before analyzing it as a regular business, we have to go through my 3 golden rules. Does it save time? Does it save money? Does it save lives? And I think any business in healthcare to be of a value, it should at least achieve 2 of those 3 criteria. First is, does it save lives? I think yes. This is outcome that is hard to measure, because to measure this, you should have a group of physicians who are taking care of patients and using open evidence versus a group of patients who are taking care of patients who are not using open evidence. And these two patient populations should be similar, and then we have to follow them for for a period of time and see if there is any signal that comes from saving lives. I think it's not direct effect. It's hard to prove, but they might be saving lives by giving you access to, or giving the physician access to, the correct medical answers. So I would say partially. The other thing is, do they save time? And oh yeah, they save lots of time, because like now you don't have to go to PubMed or read long articles. You can just go to Open Evidence. And do they save money? I would say yes. I would say the opposite. They don't make you as a physician spend money. And by not spending money and having access to your answers, you might have indirect result where you save money.
Yeah, I think there might be significant downstream cost savings that open evidence can enable with the technology that they have, mainly if you can basically treat patients with the best possible information at your fingertips, reduce load on other sectors of the healthcare system, but this is, of course, yet to be determined. I'm just curious very quickly, Rupin. I know you're not an ER physician, but I'm sure you did rotations during your training. Do you think that like an emergency room physician would get any value out of open evidence because they're working so quickly across dozens of patients, where I see open evidence is really fitting into the clinical workflow where a doctor is sitting down with a patient or seeing a patient in their office or something like that. What are your thoughts there?
I don't think we should look only at like emergency physicians. Emergency physicians, or any physician, is a knowledge worker. It's a type of work that requires access to information. Any physician, regardless of their specialty, will benefit not only like from open evidence. I would say, I just want to make a general statement. They will benefit from access to clinical decision support tools to help them in their day-to-day decisions, taking care of patients. Not only emergency doctors, they need answers quickly. Me, if I'm rounding in the hospital, I need answers quickly. If I'm in the clinic seeing cancer patients, I need patient answers quickly, because like I have 15 minutes to see a patient, 5 minutes in between patients to do orders and move on to the next patient. And sometimes you might have double bookings where you have two patients at the same time. Any knowledge worker, they will need access to medical information.
Yeah, I never thought about it from the kind of through the knowledge worker lens, but I definitely see your point. Okay, so I think when it comes to your three kind of golden rules or three golden hoops that any health tech company should be able to successfully jump through, right? They do save money, they do save lives indirectly, and that may still to be determined in many ways. So they save lives, they save money, and definitely save time, I think, they save a physician time in terms of just updating their medical education, but also in a clinical environment or clinical setting, I can see how they definitely save time there as well.
The other thing we have to talk about is like any other business, I think scale economies apply here. They do have a, relatively speaking, fixed cost. Most of the cost comes at the beginning when they are building and training these models. Then they will have lower costs to serve physicians, especially if they are running small language models. And I think, or I assume, the inference cost is going to be lower when it comes to open evidence when compared to other large language model companies, since they are creating specialized language models.
I agree with you by and large from a scale economies perspective. I think the play that they're making with these smaller specialized language models that they're in the process of developing at the moment, it's something that is yet to be determined, I would say, just what kind of costs they might incur. And as they start to scale and start to work directly with different hospital systems, if a hospital system comes to them and says, great, we love your technology, but we want to run it on premise, this is where, you can now no longer leverage significant cloud savings that you get from the platforms you're partnered with. And if you have to start running these models on premise, building your own server racks, GPU racks to run the models, That's one area where I think it's still yet to be determined just how successful open evidence will be in those kinds of environments where they have to deploy their models on premise.
Yeah. And the other thing here is beyond the scale economies, they do have a strong network effect. Physicians now recommend open evidence to each other, and that has the strongest marketing effect ever. There is no such thing a physician will trust as much as a recommendation from another colleague, not from a company, not from an ad, from another colleague. And here we see a strong network effect. I would add one thing here is Daniel Nadler is very strong at marketing. Through the development of this episode and talking to people, I was surprised by the amount of TV interviews that this guy went on. He's all over the place selling his company. He's always on TVs, he's giving talks, he's on the news, he's talking about open evidence. And I don't watch TV, so I've never seen this. But through my search and reading about the company, you can see tons of interviews on YouTube that Daniel Nadler did. And this is unlike the image that I had in my mind. I thought like he would be more like conservative and he's not very outgoing, but based on all the interviews, like he's very extroverted and very strong marketer.
I think when you become a CEO of a $12 billion company that has raised funding at the record levels that they have, you really you don't really have much of a choice about going on that press tour, right? You are now effectively the face of the company, and like you, I don't know much about his social personality and just how social of an individual he might be. But based on the interviews that he did, I think it was a situation where he really had no choice if he wanted to do them or didn't want to do them, because all eyes really have been on open evidence, and they still are. This episode's being recorded almost 2-3 weeks after their latest funding announcement, and we're still seeing ripple effects, and we're still seeing all the buzz on social media being about open evidence. So it would be irresponsible as a CEO almost not to capitalize on all of this hype. But I think the real work will begin once this hype dies down, right? News runs in cycles. Once the cycle about open evidence is over, it's really going to be interesting to see in the next 3 to 6 months what they choose to do with all this capital they've raised.
Yeah. And then the other thing here is their counter positioning. And for listeners who don't know what does that mean, in business strategy is when an incumbent company can't credibly copy a challenger's new business model without hurting its own existing business. And if you look at other clinical decision support tools, you can argue that UpToDate is one of the biggest competitors that offer their product through paid subscription, which is around like $500 a year. I don't see them going and offering their product for free because their main product is the clinical decision support dependent on hospitals or physicians to pay them. So UpToDate can provide this as a service, and they don't do marketing unless like UpToDate completely change their business model and they say, okay, now we're going to display some advertisements with articles and do marketing and sell physician attention rather than selling like a well-written articles by experts in the field.
I agree with you. I will say though that, from a rating perspective, when it comes to counter positioning, I wouldn't mark them strong personally, because I think what we have seen in the last 2 weeks alone, and to our listeners, right now it's February 17th, what we've seen in the last 2 weeks with how Epic has come out with CDS tools, I think we're really going towards a, David and Goliath moment coming up in the next 3 to 6 months, where we're really going to see, are hospital systems really going to even strongly consider open evidence and what it takes to integrate them versus let's just use Epic's clinical decision support tool that they just came out with, right? And it's one of those situations where OpenEvidence, I think, is going to have to fight like hell to be able to compete against the strong foothold that Epic has inside of this market, and Epic's ability to just give their existing customers the CDS tools for free, because that's Epic's entire business model, right? Pay us for the billing management workflows, pay us for the storing of the data and the management of the data, and we'll give you all of these additional features and modules over on top of that for free. So now from a hospital IT perspective, they really have to stop and sit down and think, okay, do we just activate this one module from the software vendor that we've been using for the past 2-3 decades? Or do we now let another company, another vendor come into the mix?
I didn't know that Epic did Epic release like a clinical decision support tool?
Yeah, it's out.
Really? I didn't see that. Now let's talk about switching costs. I would say switching costs here are very low. I don't feel like there are any switching costs. The reason is there are so many tools out there right now, and me personally, I like using all these tools. Like I like using Doximity GPT. I like using OpenEvidence. There is also another tool called the Glass Health. In my opinion, this is very similar to the reason that I like to use ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini. These are different experts with different voice and different backgrounds, and each one of them has its own personality. Now, after 3 years of using AI every single day, hundreds of times, when I chat with AI, you can feel that each one of them have their own personality, and they are different. And this applies whether we're talking about like medical LLMs, like OpenEvidence, DocsGPT, or Glass Health, or non-medical LLMs.
I think this is another area actually that I would disagree with you on, because the switching costs from the individual physician's perspective, yes, right? There's not a high switching cost associated there. But now if we look at it through another lens where the end consumer or the end user is not the doctor, but it's rather the hospital system, right? I shouldn't say end user, I should say customer here, right? If the customer is the physician, then yes, switching costs are not difficult. But if the customer is the hospital system now, that's where the switching costs now start to get a little bit more competitive, and now it's a little bit harder to switch to another solution after you've already gone through a 6 to 12 months sales and implementation cycle.
Fair enough. I see your point, especially if you are looking at the user or the customer as a pharma company. Maybe there will be also like very high switching costs. Like a pharma company comes to OpenEvidence and they strike a deal, I feel like it's less likely to go to other LLM creators of generators like OpenAI or Anthropic, and so on. Next is branding. I would say branding here is very important. And given like how much physicians are more likely to use a trusted product recommended by others. And I've been thinking a lot. OpenEvidence is not the only tool that popped up at that time as a tool for clinical decision support. There have been many, but what really made OpenEvidence go this fast? One, I would say the founder himself, Daniel Nadler, had a background and he knew how to build and scale companies, and he had the capital to invest in starting a new company. So that's one. But two, as I mentioned earlier, this guy is like genius marketer. He's running 24/7 TV news, interviews. And now it's not only him. You can even see like Zachary Ziegler also like doing interviews, going outside, talking to people. And I would say they've done a really great job in building a strong brand. I would add one thing here, as I mentioned earlier, is like OpenEvidence becomes mainly an AI company and not a clinical decision support company, where their main product is creating LLMs for healthcare and life sciences. And the clinical decision support tool is just a marketing tool and a way to access the market. And that will increase the valuation maybe to, I don't know, 100 billion plus. Maybe they would go an IPO, then maybe they will become the Anthropic or OpenAI of healthcare. These could be other possibilities.
Definitely. And of all the companies that we actively engage in and research in, or that research in general for this podcast, none of those companies have had the kind of run and the kind of fundraising that OpenEvidence has done. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see over the next 5 years, 10 years, how well can they live up to this valuation of being a $12 billion company right now? And it all depends on, can they successfully make a platform play? Can they make the monetization work? And can they keep up the adoption levels that they've been putting up so far?
And as we mentioned earlier, OpenEvidence currently is at 30 employees, I believe, and their valuation is $12 billion. Replit is a product that is used by tons of people. I'm sure more than OpenEvidence, more than the number of users of OpenEvidence, because it's a vibe coding tool. For those who don't know Replit, it's a vibe coding tool. And their valuation is around $3 billion. And there is another company, Harvey AI. It's a company in law that I believe their valuation is around $9 billion. It's an AI company for law firms. And then I believe 11 Labs, it's another big company from Europe that they make text to speech and speech to speech models. They have like lots of tools for conversational AI. And I believe their valuation is around also like $11 billion. So OpenEvidence valuation is pretty high, given that, relatively speaking, the number of users of Replit and 11 Labs should be more number of users of OpenEvidence, but I think it's more the technology and the talents. That's how it's being valued.
I would agree. I think it's the technology, the talent, and the difficulty of the problem that they're solving here, right? The problems that Replit and 11 Labs are solving are still obviously big problems with huge total addressable markets, but the actual complexity and the strength that you can derive from having the kind of partnerships that OpenEvidence does, those contribute heavily to their defensibility. And that incredible defensibility that they have at this moment in time is, I think, a key driver of that valuation that they are operating at currently. However, important to note here that all of the efforts and all of the time that has been put into building OpenEvidence up to what it is today, you know, this could even be a solution of a runaway valuation. And that's where the bear case comes in quite a bit, where if Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, they launch free competing products in this space, and existing incumbents that maybe might not be competitive yet, but they have the capital and they have the runway to catch up in the next 2 or 3 years, this is where we might come across a situation where OpenEvidence is not able to capture the monopoly that they need inside of this market, and the market fragments, breaks up, and now there's no clear winner, and there's just multiple players that end up operating in this space.
Yeah, especially like right now, as we mentioned earlier, that Claude and Anthropic, you can turn on PubMed search. And I did comparison. I did get good answers with PubMed links using Claude, but I didn't use it through the chat interface. I use it through the terminal, and it was able to give me like, when I asked a medical question, it was able to give me like a text and PubMed articles that support that text. But again, Claude is not mainly for healthcare, and it might make mistakes and doesn't provide an answer where it tells me that this answer is written this way in this resource. Is up to you, physician. Go and decide what to do with it.
Yeah, and I think the promises that both companies make is different as well. Anthropic and Claude aren't making the promise of, you know, insane levels of reliability and insane levels of accuracy. Obviously, they're very good and they're very competitive in those areas, but OpenEvidence is basically saying, no, we have cracked the code here to make sure that the reliability and the accuracy levels that physicians require to be able to operate at their highest levels, that is what we are able to do, and that is what we are able to do better than anyone else. And I think that, those two metrics that I just mentioned of accuracy and reliability, those are the ones that doctors care about more than anything.
Yeah. And then the other thing would happen also, that the bear case here is maybe open evidence is mainly a clinical decision support tool and not an AI company. If that's the case, I do wonder is, would pharma partnerships and advertisement support the current valuation and will increase the valuation? But don't think that's the case.
I don't think they would, honestly. I think if they choose to solely operate in this clinical decision support niche, then there's no way they can support a $12 billion valuation with just marketing partnerships with pharmaceutical companies alone. They really need to go wide and capture as much market share as they possibly can in order to live up to this valuation. Because as we mentioned some of the companies previously just now, OpenEvidence does have an incredibly high valuation. Now they have the talent and they have the adoption rate to support it, but it's a question moving forward. Can they support this long term? Is this sustainable growth?
The other thing can happen also is like regulatory crackdown, where we haven't seen this, but a while ago, we've seen the first case of a lawsuit due to the use of AI Scribe. I'm not going to name a company or an AI Scribe company or a hospital, but a patient saw their note written by an AI Scribe and they asked the hospital to remove this note. The hospital said, like, the vendor, usually they retain this note for 30 days, and the patient didn't like this, so he sued the hospital and I believe maybe the vendor. We haven't seen something similar in the clinical decision support space since right now the FDA released recently what qualifies the clinical decision support and if they would require or they won't require FDA clearance, but we might see a liability lawsuit where a patient might die due to like wrong open evidence recommendation. And the question here becomes like, who's liable? Is it the physician? Is it the AI? Maybe trust evaporates from the market, the usage collapses, people go back to the old ways. All these things are possibilities that could happen.
Definitely. And I can tell you from experience right now in the health technology industry in general, this is one of the biggest questions on every chief legal officer's mind right now. Who is responsible at the end of the day? If open evidence gives advice that ends up harming the patient, but the clinician still reviewed that advice, is the liability on the clinician? Is it on open evidence? Is it on us as a hospital overall for choosing to use this tool? So these are going to be critical questions that are going to be answered. And these lawsuits, as Rupin mentioned, that are popping up left, right, and center, these are going to be major cases for really establishing precedent here as well, because we've now entered the era where CDS, clinical decision support, CDS tools are being used far and wide across the US healthcare system. There is going to be an issue moving forward of accountability and liability, and it'll be curious to see the results that are coming out of these cases, because that'll really help us understand where things are going and what can these companies do and what can they not do. Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to, can we maintain the level of trust that we have with physicians? And if that trust evaporates, usage is going to collapse as well. And if that ends up happening, and going back to the bear case now as well, we might end up seeing a situation where there is an acquisition of open evidence, where a year or two from now, they're running low on cash, they can't achieve the profitability that was expected of them. And I could easily see Google or Microsoft coming in for 5-10 billion and just buying the entire IP and the entire team of open evidence in general, because Google has been trying to crack the healthcare for decades now, and they just haven't been able to. And, $5-10 billion isn't a lot of money for Google or Microsoft to shell out to be able to acquire the IP that open evidence has.
Yeah.
Between the bear case and the bull case, what do you think is going to be the most likely outcome?
In my opinion, I think this clinical decision support, it's a marketing thing. It's a way to get to the market and get users on board. But what I believe open evidence is It's an AI company, a self-marketing company, self-medical decision support company, and they are really good at building specialized models. I believe, or I think that's where things are going. They will do more partnership. They will do more partnerships. They will go enterprise. They will go to pharma. They will go to micro. And we've seen this through going to like Microsoft and the pharma partnership that we talked about. I believe it was Viva. Um, that's the way I think this company is going to go. I don't think there will be an IPO. There might be an acquisition. That's my prediction. I think they might get acquired before an IPO, unless Daniel Nadler himself, like he wants to go public and grow this further, and he doesn't want to do an IPO. So yeah, that's my feeling. How about you? What do you think?
Well, I think from a, to IPO or to not IPO perspective, obviously Daniel has a big role and a big say in it, but we also need to go back and think about who are their investors at the end, right? We're talking about companies like
They want to make
Sequoia.
me. They want to back. Completely agree with you.
Yeah, right. Sequoia, Google Ventures, they, at the end of the day, their inherent thesis is governed by the power law of venture capital. And so if a acquirer comes along, if a Google comes along and says, yes, we're willing to buy this technology for 20 billion, $30 billion, we might end up with a situation where Daniel Nadler and Zachary Ziegler both say, no, we want to take this company public. But Sequoia and Google Ventures might come forward and say, no, we don't have a strong level of conviction about an IPO and we want our return to fund. So I think that might be a situation that could play out. That's just a hypothetical in my head at the moment. But it'll be curious to see, because if Google comes along, Daniel walks away with anywhere from $5 to $10 billion. He might move on to the next venture, or he might just throw himself into the world of art and poetry full time. Yet to be seen, but widely kind of overarching, I think the most likely outcome here is going to be an acquisition at the end of the day. Google is just waiting for the company to get to kind of hit certain metrics that they're already not far away from. And then one of these big tech companies is going to come in and they're going to make a crazy offer. That's my hypothesis.
Yeah, and it's exciting. Let's see where this is going to go.
Yeah, it's one to watch in our future episodes as well.
We might do a recap in 2-3 years and go back to this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be fun. That would be fun to see, how accurate were our hypotheses and how accurate were our predictions.
All right. To our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to send them to us.
I just want to give a huge thank you as well to the individuals at OpenEvidence who took time out of their day to tell us their story, tell us why they joined this company, what they believe their vision is for it. So a huge thank you to them. Without them, this episode would not have been possible.
And also thank you to Matt Fisher, amazing person who gave up his time and talked to us about HIPAA compliance and BA.
One more time, huge thanks to PMWC for sponsoring this episode. PMWC 2026 will be hosted in Santa Clara, California from March 4th through March 6th. The theme for this year, From Code to Cure, 25 years running, co-hosted by Stanford, UCSF, and Yale. There will be over 2,500 attendees, more than 400 speakers across 12 different tracks. If you want to be in the room where precision medicine meets AI, this is it. Register at pmwcintl.com and use code DeltaHealth, DeltaHealth, for a discount. We'll drop the link in the show notes. And once again, thank you for listening.
Awesome. All right, Matt.